Chapter 21. If a Man Entice a Maid. It was in Kirtland, as we have seen, that Joseph began to tamper delicately with one of the most basic mores in Occidental society. He looked upon that society with the singular detachment that can come only to a man satisfied with his own ultimate authority and possessed by a longing to remold the world closer to his heart's desire. Nothing was so sacred that it could not be recast into a new utility or a new beauty. Monogamy seemed to him, as it has seemed to many men who have not ceased to love their wives but who have grown weary of connubial exclusiveness, an intolerably circumscribed way of life. "Whenever I see a pretty woman," he once said to a friend, "I have to pray for grace," as reported to W. Weil by J.W.C., Mormon Portraits, page 55. But Joseph was no careless libertine who could be content with clandestine mistresses. There was too much of the Puritan in him, and he could not rest until he had redefined the nature of sin and erected a stupendous theological edifice to support his new theories on marriage. By the spring of 1840 this edifice was almost complete, and had become so integral a part of his metaphysical system that he probably completely lost sight of the fact that it had not figured at all in the original design. Joseph was not given to self-searching, or he might have been troubled by the intensity of his preoccupation with the nature of adultery. But when he described the new patriarchal order of marriage to Parley Pratt during their weeks together in Philadelphia in 1840, it was with the freshness and enthusiasm of a man who had stumbled quite by chance upon an ancient treasure. "He taught me many great and glorious principles concerning God and the heavenly order of eternity," Pratt said. "It was at this time that I received from him the first idea of eternal family organization, and the eternal union of the sexes in those inexpressible, endearing relationships which none but the highly intellectual, the refined and pure in heart, know how to prize, and which are the foundation of everything worthy to be called happiness." Autobiography, page 329. George A. Smith often testified that Joseph Smith taught him the principle of polygamy in 1839. Pratt had buried his first wife, with whom he had been very much in love, and had since remarried. Joseph now promised him that he would have both wives in heaven, provided that he was sealed to them in the temple under the new and everlasting covenant. And since heaven would bless his union with both wives in the hereafter, it could not logically frown on his having more than one wife on earth. There was plenty of precedent for plural marriages in the Old Testament, beginning with Father Abraham. But it was Jacob's polygamous marriages that particularly interested Joseph Smith, and he frequently referred to the new marriage principle as the blessing of Jacob. He was fond of pointing to the commandment in Exodus, "And if a man entice a maid that is not betrothed, and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife." The sin of adultery lay not in the act itself, but in the subsequent desertion. It was the abandonment of the humbled maid that led to the unspeakable evils of prostitution and infanticide. Joseph taught none of this openly, for he feared that polygamy would bring down the wrath of the Gentiles. Until the day it could be publicly proclaimed, any whisper of the doctrine of plural wives must be vehemently denied, and any man caught preaching it without his own personal sanction must be summarily cut off from the church. Eventually, all the saints would be taken into his confidence and welded into a force that could oppose any Gentile threat, but until then the little lie must be voiced to protect the great truth. To break the ground before sowing broadcast the seeds of his new doctrine, Joseph's press published a pamphlet in defense of polygamy by one Ud H. Jacob. Jacob produced a document of astonishing sophistication, advocating polygamy not only in the light of Old Testament precedent, but also as a solution for marital incompatibility. "What, although a woman is not known to be an adulteress," he wrote, "yet she may be a perfect devil to her husband, train him in the most imperious manner, despise him in her heart, abuse him before his children, drive him like a menial slave where she pleases. And he must tamely submit to the ungodly law of his wife, must hug the serpent to his bosom, and love her as he does his own body. Impossible and degrading to the nature of man. Such a wife must not be divorced," he said, "for a divorced man is not known in the whole canon of Scriptures. But for her to continue performing the rituals of the marriage bed without any love for her husband, which he labeled fornication in the wife was a gross sin. In ancient times, under the law of God, he concluded, the permission of a plurality of wives had a direct tendency to prevent the possibility of fornication in the wife. Whether Jacob was describing his own married state, or Joseph's, or simply that of any poor bedevilled male, one cannot know. But there is no doubt that Jacob looked upon women as the inferior species. The idea of a woman taking a man to be her husband is not found in the Word of God. But the man marries the woman, and the woman is given in marriage. But the husband is not the property of the wife in any sense of the word. There is no positive law of God against a man's marrying Leah and Rachel both. To God only are men accountable in this matter, and not to their wives. Undihe Jacob, an Israelite and a shepherd of Israel, an extract from a manuscript entitled The Peacemaker, or The Doctrines of the Millennium, being a treatise on religion and jurisprudence, or A New System of Religion and Politics, Nauvoo, Illinois, 1842, pages 55, 16. This pamphlet was published in 1842 in Nauvoo under the Prophet's auspices. The title page lists J. Smith as printer, although he was quickly forced to denounce it, but it must be considered a mere fragment of his elaborate framework of justification for plural marriage. Paul had said that in heaven there would be no marriage or giving in marriage, but Joseph taught that this would not apply to his saints. That which he and his elders sealed on earth would be binding also in heaven. There a man would have not only his wives and children, but also the prerogative of procreating more, until, as he expressed it to Parley Pratt, the result of our endless union would be offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven or the sands of the seashore. This was the road to godhood. See Pratt's autobiography, page 329, History of the Church, Volume 5, page 391-2, and Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. A man's glory in the next world would be determined by the knowledge he had gained in the excellence of his works upon earth. He who entered heaven with 10 talents would have tenfold the glory of a man with 1, and his rate of progress toward godhood would be 10 times as rapid as that of the man who had been blind to the truth upon earth. Similarly, if a man went to heaven with 10 wives, he would have more than tenfold the blessings of a mere monogamist, for all the children begotten through these wives would enhance his kingdom. The man with only 1 wife, on the other hand, would be denied even her, and forced to spend eternity as a ministering angel rather than a god. Joseph taught that God himself was once as we are now, and is an exalted man. He had increased in skill and wisdom until he had come to govern myriads of worlds, peopled by spirits of his own procreation. Ahead of every man there stretched this same boundless opportunity for progression throughout eternity. The rate of his spiritual growth would accelerate in direct proportion to the speed with which he accepted God's laws and performed God's rituals. Lorenzo Snow caught the essence of this philosophy in a terse and provocative line. As man is, God once was, and as God is, man may become. It was the most challenging concept that Joseph Smith ever produced, and, in a sense, the most original. It will be seen that the Mormon heaven was as changing, tumultuous, and infinitely varied as earth itself. Converts reared on a diet of harps and angels found this heaven exciting. To those infected with the prodigious optimism and enthusiasm of America, it seemed only reasonable that there need be no end to the explorations of the human spirit. To men who loved their wives, it was pleasant to hear that death was no separation, and to men who did not, it was gratifying to hear that there could be no sin in taking another. To every man in love with life, with the tantalizing richness of learning, the sweaty satisfaction of hard work, the luxury of sensual pleasure, Joseph's heaven had profound meaning. Although many of the leading Mormon officials converted their first wives to polygamy before taking a second, Joseph did not take Emma into his confidence. Neither did he confide in his friends. There was disagreement among them in later years, even over the identity of his first plural wife. Some, like Benjamin Johnson, were certain that it had been Fanny Alger, who, after being expelled from Joseph's home in Kirtland, had. But others held that plural marriage was not officially inaugurated until the 5th of April, 1841, the eve of the 11th anniversary of the founding of the church, when he married the attractive 26-year-old Louisa Beeman. But it is doubtful if Louisa was even second on the list. The most famous woman in the church was William Morgan's widow Lucinda, now married to George W. Harris, one of Joseph's key men, and incidentally a Mason of high rank. Although now almost 40, the small, bright blue-eyed Lucinda had lost little of her blonde beauty. It happened that she and Sarah Pratt were good friends, and she is said to have admitted to Mrs. Pratt in 1842 that she had been the prophet's mistress since 4 years. For documentation on the details of Joseph's plural wives, see Appendix C. Mormon historians, although listing Mrs. Harris as one of Joseph's plural wives, have been reluctant to admit the authenticity of Sarah Pratt's statement, since its implications are embarrassing. But they supply no date of the marriage ceremony, and it would appear that if indeed any ceremony was performed at all, it took place in Far West in 1838, when the prophet was living in the Harris home. The extreme informality attending Joseph's earliest marriages, at least as it appears in the available records, is even more evident in the story of the prophet's relationship with Prescindia Huntington Buell. During the Missouri troubles of 1838-9, her husband, Norman Buell, temporarily left the church. About this time, she admitted later that she did not know whether Norman Buell or the prophet was the father. But the physiognomy revealed in a rare photograph of Oliver Buell seems to weight the balance overwhelmingly on the side of Joseph's paternity. And there is evidence in the diary of the boy's uncle, Oliver Huntington, that young Buell was later officially sealed or adopted to the prophet in the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City. However, Prescindia seems not to have been married to Joseph Smith officially until December 2, 1841, sometime after this child was born. She remained nominally Mrs. Buell and lived with Norman Buell in Lima, Illinois, until a year and a half after Joseph's death, when she left Buell permanently and became a plural wife of Heber's. Before the expulsion of John C. Bennett in June 1842, Joseph had been married or sealed to an imposing list of women, almost all of them already married. In addition to Louisa Beeman, Mrs. Harris, and Mrs. Buell, there were Mrs. Zena Huntington Jacobs, Mrs. Mary Rollins Leitner, Patty Sessions, possibly Mrs. Clarissa Hancock and Mrs. Sally Gully, and probably Mrs. Nancy Hyde, with a doubtful Mrs. Durfee at the bottom of the list. There were undoubtedly others, for John C. Bennett, who knew of several of these marriages, hinted at others which cannot be identified from the available document. Bennett listed Miss L.B., who was married to Joseph Smith by Joseph Bates Noble. This is clearly Louisa Beeman. His Mrs. B. is doubtless Mrs. Buell, and his Mrs. S. is Mrs. Sessions. Mrs. D. is probably Mrs. Durfee, and Mrs. G. is possibly Mrs. Sally Gaddy, but Mrs. S. is said to have been married to Joseph by Brigham Young, and Miss B. remains mysterious. Stanley Ivins has uncovered evidence that this may be a Miss Sarah Babson. Most attractive of all these women was the vivacious 20-year-old Zina Huntington Jacobs, whom Joseph had taken into his home for a time during the Great Plague of 18. Zina had been married to Henry B. Jacobs on the 7th of March, 1841. And at the time of her sealing to Joseph, on the 27th of October, 1841, she was 7 months pregnant with Jacob's child. Jacobs then apparently knew nothing of this special ceremony, for when he toured southern Illinois with John D. Lee in the winter of 1842, he talked constantly of his wife's loveliness and fidelity. Zena's marriage with Jacobs proved unhappy, although she did not leave him until 1846, shortly before the birth of her second son, when she became one of the already numerous wives of Brigham Young. In January of that year, 18 months after Joseph's death, her marriage to the prophet was again solemnized, this time in the newly completed Nauvoo Temple. She was sealed to Joseph for eternity and to Brigham Young for time. Jacob stood humbly by as a witness. See the Nauvoo Temple Record, 1846, also Appendix C. Only one of these married women described Joseph's courtship. This was Mary Elizabeth Rollins, who had adored Joseph from the time of her adolescent conversion in New York State, and who was now married to the friendly but non-Mormon Adam Leitner. Although not married to Joseph Smith until February 1842, Mrs. Lightner reported that Joseph told her he had been commanded to take her for a wife as early as 1834. "I was then 1,000 miles from him," she wrote. "He got afraid. The angel came to him 3 times, the last time with a drawn sword, and threatened his life." When Joseph told her about the angel in 1842, she refused to believe him. "If God told him so, why did he not come and tell me? The angel told him I should have a witness. An angel came to me. It went through me like lightning. I was afraid. Joseph said I was his before I came here, and he said all the devils in hell should never get me from him. I was sealed to him in the Masonic Hall." Over the old brick store by Brigham Young in February 1842. For Mrs. Lightner's complete statement, see Appendix C. The story of the drawn sword appears frequently in the testimonies of the early polygamists. Joseph told Lorenzo Snow that he had hesitated and deferred from time to time until an angel of God stood by him with a drawn sword and told him that unless he moved forward and established plural marriage, his priesthood would be taken from him and he should be destroyed. Eliza R. Snow Smith, Biography of Lorenzo Snow, pages 69 to 70. See also the Benjamin F. Johnson manuscript. The men who were taken into the system at this early period: Hiram Smith, Brigham Young, Heber Kimball, William Clayton, Willard Richards, and Benjamin F. Johnson, after an initial period of shock and spiritual torment, were won over with very little argument. Joseph's brother Don Carlos fought polygamy before his death in 1841. "Any man," he said to Ebenezer Robinson in June of that year, "who will preach and practice spiritual wifery will go to hell, no matter if it is my brother Joseph." Robinson was co-editor of Times and Seasons with Don Carlos. See his reminiscences in The Return, Volume 3, February 1891, page 28. But William Smith was an eager convert. His first plural wife was Mary Ann Sheffield, who had left a husband in England. "I never met William Smith but once before I married him," she related. "I met him coming from Keokuk. I think that was in April 1843. I do not know if I lived with him 2 weeks, cannot tell whether I lived with him 1 week or not. Before the death of his first wife in 1845, William took at least 4 other plural wives. Their names were Mary Jones, Priscilla Morgridge, Sarah Livy, and Hannah Livy. See the testimonies of several of these women, published in the Temple Lot case, pages 380-384. Also J.F. Smith, Jr., Blood Atonement, and the Origin of Plural Marriage, page 49. But the true measure of the magnetism of plural marriage can be seen best in the attitude of the Mormon women. They required very little more persuasion than the men, though the reasons are not so obvious. Nauvoo was a severe town, puritanical and acutely self-righteous. But it was a town full of church widows, whose husbands were out proselyting, spreading the gospel in the East, in the South, in Canada, and in England. Several were making ready to go to the South Sea Islands. Orson Hyde, on the way to Palestine to dedicate that land to the restoration of the Jews, was exploring the possibilities of missions in Germany and Russia. Whether Nancy Hyde became a polygamous wife of Joseph Smith when Orson Hyde was on this mission, or earlier, is not clear. But her circumstances were typical of those of many women who found polyandry to their liking. Moreover, Nauvoo was troubled by the old problem of the separated but undivorced female convert. Divorce was usually impossible, and so many women were pouring into Nauvoo eager to marry again that it was difficult for the church to maintain the discipline that would have been normal in a settled community. Marriage standards were extremely flexible all along the frontier. It was easy, therefore, for many of the penniless and lonely women converts to slip into polygamy. But for every woman who entered the system for reasons of security, and of fragile security at that, there were a dozen for whom this necessity did not arise. There was no need whatever for the attractive virgin to become a 2nd, 3rd, or 13th wife, since frontier areas always had a surplus of men. And what of the married women who gladly signed themselves and their children over to the prophet's keeping and glory for eternity, leaving their unwitting husbands to be wifeless and childless in the celestial kingdom? Was this a melancholy commentary on their own marriage state, or a tribute to Joseph's charm, or was it perhaps a smothered yearning for new experiences, released now by opportunity masquerading as religious duty? It should have been obvious to Joseph that polygamous marriages could not long be kept secret, and soon the first fruits of Up to this time, Joseph had taken care that almost all of his own plural wives were married women, but his leading elders could not easily follow his example. No one in the whole of Nauvoo had a more strategic vantage point from which to discover exactly what was going on than the famous midwife Patty Sessions, a slim, wiry woman with hands admirably small for her work. She delivered babies for fees ranging from 50 cents to $3 and was more esteemed than any doctor in the city. In the spring of 1842, Joseph added her to his circle of wives. Her daughter, Sylvia, who stood as witness at the marriage of her mother, also became his wife, but this apparently Patty never knew. She recorded her own marriage proudly in her secret journal, and from that moment forward knew her duty to the new order. Joseph H. Jackson, who claimed to have been in the prophet's confidence for a time, stated that Mrs. Sessions, Mrs. Durfee, and a Mrs. Taylor were called mothers in Israel, and their duty was to instruct the younger women in the mysteries of polygamy. Whether Mrs. Taylor became a wife of the prophet is not known. Narrative of the Adventures and Experiences of Joseph H. Jackson, Warsaw, Illinois, 1844, page 14. After the expulsion of John C. Bennett, the blame for the fatherless children arriving in the city was laid at his door. Oliver Olney, The Absurdities of Mormonism Portrayed, page 19. But, while he was still in power, suspicion fell on every man who was seen out after curfew. The number of first wives who knew the truth about polygamy was then extremely small, and the remainder were seething with suspicion and furiously angry at what seemed to be the appalling moral laxity in Nauvoo. The Female Relief Society, which Joseph had organized in mid-March 1842 with Emma as president, was quickly diverted from charitable offices to the purging of iniquity, with a passion that probably came less from her exalted standards of moral behavior than from an unuttered dread of what she might discover. Emma probed and questioned every woman who came into the organization. Assisting her in the leadership of the society were some of the ablest women in the church: Mrs. Elizabeth Ann Whitney, Mrs. Sarah M. Cleveland, Elvira Cowles, and the poetess Eliza R. Snow. Joseph publicly commended them for their zeal in making a select society of the virtuous, but warned them that they must be extremely careful in their examinations, or the consequences would be serious. History of the Church, Volume 4, page 570. Eventually, every one of these women became his plural wife, with the exception of Mrs. Whitney, who granted him instead the privilege of marrying her 17-year-old daughter Sarah. The practice of enlarging the circle of wives in order to win the loyalty of influential Nauvoo women was effective up to a point, after which it became highly. Sooner or later, some woman would be sufficiently revolted by polygamy to tell the whole world about what was going on in Nauvoo. Mrs. Sarah M. Kimball, whom Joseph approached in 1842, told him to teach the concept to someone else, but she kept silent. Sarah M. Granger Kimball, wife of Hiram S. Kimball, later swore to an affidavit saying, "Early in 1842, Joseph taught me the principle of marriage for eternity and the doctrine of plural marriage. I asked him to teach it to someone else. He looked at me reprovingly, saying, 'I will not cease to pray for you.'" Historical Record, Volume 6, page 232. Mrs. Orson Pratt, who also refused the prophet, confided in a few friends, but did not discuss polygamy publicly until she was an embittered and lonely old woman. But a self-possessed 18-year-old English girl, Martha Brotherton, chose to speak her mind. Brigham Young, who had not been lax in following his prophet's lead, had set his heart on the high-spirited English lass. He took her to the famous rendezvous over Joseph's store, locked the door, and proceeded with the curious, bob-tailed hortatory courtship that was becoming so common in the city. Brother Joseph has had a revelation from God that it is lawful and right for a man to have 2 wives. If you will accept of me, I will take you straight to the celestial kingdom. And if you will have me in this world, I will have you in that which is to come. And Brother Joseph will marry us here today, and you can go home this evening. And your parents will not know anything about it." When the girl demurred and begged for time, Brigham called in Joseph, who also urged her to make an immediate decision. "Just go ahead and do as Brigham wants you to," he said, and added with a laugh, "He is the best man in the world, except me." Then he went on more seriously, "If you will accept of Brigham, you shall be blessed. God shall bless you, and my blessing shall rest upon you. And if you do not like it in a month or two, come to me, and I will make you free again. And if he turns you off, I will take you on." "Sir, it will be too late to think in a month or two after," Martha answered wryly. "I want time to think first." To this the prophet replied, "But the old proverb is, 'Nothing ventured, nothing gained.'" Finally and reluctantly, they let her go home, where she promised to pray in secret for guidance. The moment she arrived, however, she wrote down the whole episode while it was still fresh in her memory, and showed it to her parents. The Brothertons in high dudgeon took a steamboat to St. Louis, but not before they had given Martha's recital enough circulation so that everyone in Nauvoo knew it within a week. Eventually Martha published her account in a St. Louis paper. See the St. Louis Bulletin, the 15th of July, 1842, page 2. This was reprinted in many Eastern and Illinois papers, and also in Bennett's History of the Saints. The prophet never replied directly to her charges, but Heber Kimball and Brigham Young called her story a base falsehood. And Martha's two sisters and brother-in-law, who had remained true to the church, were persuaded to swear that she was not only a liar but also a harlot. See affidavits and certificates disproving the statements and affidavits contained in John C. Bennett's letters, a pamphlet published by the church leaders on the 31st of August, 1842. Elizabeth Brotherton, who signed one of these statements against Martha, became the plural wife of Parley Pratt on the 24th of July, 1843. See Utah Genealogical and Historical Magazine, Volume 27, 1936, pages 108-9. But even before it appeared, Joseph had taken measures to kill the rumors her departure had set in motion. Hiram, at the April conference, contradicted the report that a sister had been shut in a room for several days, and that they endeavored. The 12 apostles all testified that Joseph's principles were strictly virtuous, and Joseph himself took the stand in a blistering sermon against all adulterers and fornicators who were making use of his name to sanction their corruption. "We have among us," he said in part, "thieves, adulterers, liars, hypocrites. If God should speak from heaven, he would command you not to steal, not to commit adultery, not to covet, nor deceive, but be faithful over a few things. As far as we degenerate from God, we descend to the devil and lose knowledge, and without knowledge we cannot be saved. The church must be cleansed, and I proclaim against all iniquity. A man is saved no faster than he gets knowledge." See History of the Church, Volume 4, pages 585-8, for a complete report of the minutes of this conference. Joseph could with a certain honesty inveigh against adultery in the same week that he slept with another man's wife, or indeed several men's wives, because he had interposed a very special marriage ceremony. And who was to say him nay, since in the Gentile world the simple pronouncement of a few time-worn phrases by any justice of peace was all that was necessary to transform fornication into blessed matrimony. The spoken word stood between him and his own guilt, and with Joseph the word was God. Chapter 22. The Bennett Explosion. It is one of the odd coincidences of Mormon history that the three men who most astutely judged the potentialities of the Mormon movement all bore the name Bennett. James Gordon Bennett, editor of the New York Herald, though fascinated by the Mormon phenomenon, was content to watch it from a distance. James Arlington Bennett, a prominent New York lawyer and textbook writer, wrote admiring and imaginative letters which much influenced Joseph Smith, but he delayed going to Nauvoo until after the prophet's death. But John Cook Bennett, sensing the dynamism in the church, and no doubt attracted by the rumors of polygamy, wasted no time in entrenching himself. For a year and a half he was Joseph's most intimate friend, showered with favors that older converts who had sacrificed fortune and health to the gospel would have given much to share. Only those close to the prophet knew of the stormy sessions that marred this friendship. for Bennett was too ambitious and too wayward to stay in favor. Callous, profligate, and too wise in his profession as physician and instructor of midwifery, he was eager to exploit polygamy. After the two men broke completely, Joseph said in a guarded public statement that he had caught Bennett preaching promiscuous intercourse as early as December 1840 and had let him off with a severe. Then, in mid-July 1841, he had again discovered that Bennett was seducing innocent women, this time in the name of the prophet and with the promise of marriage. Joseph said that when he confronted Bennett with the evidence, and also with letters showing him to be a wife deserter, Bennett, in despair, took poison. Not enough to kill himself, though. He was physician enough to be able to measure the correct dose, but enough to convince everyone that his repentance was sincere. History of the Church, Volume 5, pages 37-42. Actually, Bennett may have been taking spiritual wives with Joseph's complete sanction, as were Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball early in 1842. But it is clear from the innuendos in Joseph's statement that Bennett looked upon the whole celestial marriage paraphernalia as mere show, and dispensed with it whenever he pleased. Unlike Joseph, he had never been troubled by the necessity of rationalizing his own impulses or of squaring himself with God. By the spring of 1842, Joseph realized that he was nurturing a volatile and dangerous rival. He suspected Bennett of plotting to have him accidentally shot at the Legion target practice. But the actual spark that set off the explosion of his expulsion seems to have been ignited by a rivalry for the affections of 19-year-old Nancy Rigdon. Since Joseph's courtship of Nancy was described by her brother John and her brother-in-law George W. Robinson, as well as by Bennett, there is no reason for doubting the story. Joseph arranged for a private interview with Nancy at the home of Mrs. Orson Hyde, but Nancy had been forewarned by Bennett and met his exhortations with tears and abuse, finally threatening to scream until the whole town came running unless he let her go home. The next day Joseph made the mistake of dictating a letter to her. Happiness is the object and design of our existence, and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it. And this path is virtue, uprightness, and faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God. But we cannot keep all the commandments without first knowing them. Whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, although we may not see the reason thereof till long after the events transpire. If we seek first the kingdom of God, all good things will be added. So with Solomon, first he asked wisdom, and God gave it him, and with it every desire of his heart, even things which might be considered abominable to all who understand the order of heaven only in part, but which in reality were right, because God sanctioned by special revelation. This letter was perhaps the first forthright argument for polygamy that Joseph ever put to paper. Nancy gave this letter to Francis Higbee, who turned it over to Bennett, who in turn published it in his History of the Saints, pages 243-5. It was unsigned, and in the handwriting of Willard Richards. The Utah Church published it as an essay on happiness ostensibly written by Joseph Smith, in the History of the Church, Volume 5, pages 134. It is not positively known what occasioned the writing of this essay. Nancy showed it to her father, who until now had apparently been completely ignorant of polygamy, and told him of Joseph's advances. Wild with fury, Rigdon sent for him at once. George Robinson, who was present when he arrived, wrote to a friend that Joseph at first denied everything, but when Rigdon thrust the letter in his face, he broke down and admitted the truth, lamely excusing himself by saying that he had merely been testing Nancy's virtue. See Robinson's letter to James Arlington Bennett, also spelled Bennett, of Long Island, dated Nauvoo, the 27th of July, 1842. This Bennett admitted in the New York Herald, the 4th of November, 1842, that he gave the letter to John Cook Bennett, who published it in his History of the Saints, page 246. The story got out, Nancy's brother John commented in later years, and it became the talk of the town that Joseph had made a proposition to Nancy Rigdon to become his wife, and that she refused him. John W. Rigdon's affidavit is published in Joseph F. Smith, Jr. Blood, Atonement, and the Origin of Plural Marriage. The prophet could ill afford a new scandal, following so close upon the heels of Martha Brotherton's. Blaming Bennett for the whole imbroglio, he decided to put an end to his insolence, and on May 2, 1842, he drew up a bull of excommunication, History of the Church, Volume 5, page 74. But he knew that Bennett could be the most deadly enemy the Church had ever faced. Seeking a way to stop his mouth, he called in several women whose names had been linked with that of the celebrated doctor, and questioned them sharply. Now, apparently for the first time, he learned the full measure of Bennett's debauchery. Bennett had seduced innumerable women in Joseph's name, quite without benefit of ceremony. Even worse, he had promised abortion to those who became pregnant. Zeruiah N. Goddard, repeating the gossip of Sarah Pratt, reported that Dr. Bennett told her he could cause abortion with perfect safety to the mother at any stage of pregnancy, and that he had frequently destroyed and removed infants before their time to prevent exposure of the parties, and that he had instruments for that purpose. See the testimony of Hiram Smith, Wasp Extra, the 27th of July, 1842, republished in History of the Church, Volume 5, pages 71-2, and the statement of Zeruiah N. Goddard, with whom Sarah Pratt boarded for several months, published in Affidavits and Certificates Disproving the Statements and Affidavits contained in John C. Bennett's Letters, Nauvoo, the 31st of August, 1842. There can be no doubt that Bennett was an abortionist. Sarah Pratt told W. Will many years later that Bennett had showed her one of his instruments and indicated that he had performed illegal operations in the city. Mormon Portraits page. Joseph wrote nothing in his journal of the scene in which he faced Bennett with the affidavits he had collected, but Bennett later described the interview with his own carefully selected detail. When he entered the prophet's office, he wrote, Joseph locked the door, put the key in his pocket, drew a pistol, and said without preamble, The peace of my family requires that you should sign an affidavit and make a statement before the next city council, exonerating me from all participation whatever, whether directly or indirectly, in word or deed, in the spiritual wife doctrine or private intercourse with females in general, and if you do not do it with apparent cheerfulness, I will make catfish bait of you. Or, deliver you to the Danites for execution tonight, for my dignity and purity must and shall be maintained before the public. Letter from to the Saragamo Journai, dated the 2nd of July, 1842, published the 15th of July, 1842. Whatever the prophet actually said, no doubt there was a bitter verbal battle. Against the sworn testimonies of the women he had betrayed, Bennett had only the ambiguous, unsigned letter to Nancy Rigdon to place in the scales. But he knew several of Joseph's wives, and doubtless threatened to drag them with Joseph through a dung heap. Joseph won out, but was forced to concede Bennett the privilege of an amicable withdrawal and a public vote of thanks for his services as mayor of Nauvoo. On May 19, Bennett appeared before the city council and began with a twisted smile. I know what I am about, and the heads of the church know what they are about, I expect. I have no difficulty with the heads of the church. I publicly avow that anyone who has said that I have stated that General Joseph Smith has given me authority to hold illicit intercourse with women is a liar in the face of God. History of the Church, Volume 5, page 13. Joseph had hoped that Bennett would slip out of Nauvoo into oblivion, but he had not reckoned with the man's tenacity. Bennett prevailed on Brigham Young and Wilson Law to plead for him and did his best to placate Rigdon. Now Joseph was faced with a dismaying dilemma. Stories of Bennett's depravity had seeped through the city, and if he was now restored to favor, the prophet would be accused of countenancing abortion and prostitution. An outraged high council was grilling Bennett's closest friends, Chauncey and Francis Higbee, who justified their incontinence in the prophet's name. Yvedem, Volume 5, page. Denial and counter-denial only spread the flood of slanderous rumor that now ran wild through the city. For a time, Joseph clung to the hope that Bennett would be less dangerous in the church than out, and, despite the fact that the apostles and high council had excommunicated him on May 25, agreed to keep him in fellowship if he would make a public. In a dramatic session before 100 brethren in the Masonic Hall on May 26, Bennett, weeping like a child, told a goodly portion of his misdeeds, Then, to the astonishment and indignation of many present, Joseph pleaded mercy for him. This stand he had to justify not only to the brethren, but also to an irate relief society. "A little tale will set the world on fire," he said. "At this time, the truth on the guilty should not be told openly. Strange as this may seem, yet this is policy. It is necessary to hold an influence in the world, and thus spare ourselves an extermination. I am advised by some of the heads of the church to tell the Relief Society to be virtuous, but to save the church from desolation and the sword. Beware, be still, be prudent, repent, reform, but do it in a way not to destroy all around you." Ebedem, Volume 5, page 20. For 4 weeks more Bennett remained a sore on the church, foul-smelling and insistent on attention. Finally, Joseph became convinced that it was better to cut him off and let him do his worst than to nurture the corruption he was breeding in Nauvoo. Then it would damn him if he used the knife, but his own people would if he did not. On the 23rd of June, 1842, he publicly exposed him and issued the bull of excommunication, which had been held in reserve since the 11th of May. On the 8th of July, 1842, the Sangamo Journal in Springfield published the most sensational extra of his career. John C. Bennett, next to the prophet, the most celebrated figure in Nauvoo, had been excommunicated from the Mormon Church, and was writing the editor a series of letters the like of which the latter, in all his years of sifting scandal, libel, and election hoaxes, had never seen before. "I write you now from the Mormon Zion, the city of the saints," Bennett began the first letter, "where I am threatened with death by the Holy Joe and his Danite band of murderers, calling the prophet everything from an outrageous libertine to a foul and polluted murderer. Bennett heaped story upon story until he made Nauvoo a name to rank with Sodom and Gomorrah." His subsequent letters were published at irregular intervals up to the end of September, when they appeared, collected and revised, in a book called The History of the Saints, or An Exposé of Joe Smith and Mormonism. The long catalogue of Bennett's accusations was republished in the leading American newspapers. "The whole thing," said the New York Herald on the 24th of July, "is full of philosophy, fun, roguery, religion, truth, falsehood, fanaticism, and philosophy. Read the following extracts. Put your trust in the Lord and learn how to restrain your passions." Bennett accused Joseph of setting up a despotism on the frontier which aimed to overthrow the western states and establish an empire with himself as king. This was to be accomplished through the Legion, which, Bennett said, skirting his own peculiar responsibility in the matter, had secured 30 cannon and immense quantities of small arms from the state of Illinois. Thomas Ford, who followed Carlin as governor of Illinois, pointed out that actually only 3 cannon and 350 stand of small arms had been turned over to the Mormon militia. History of Illinois, page 267. Practically every member of the Legion, he continued, had taken the Danite oath, swearing to defend the prophet whether right or wrong. 12 of the most ruthless Danites had been set apart as destroying angels, whose business it was to spy out the prophet's enemies and assassinate them at midnight, garbed in white robes and wearing a wide red sash about their waists. There is no reliable evidence that the Danite organization was continued in Illinois, except among Joseph's personal bodyguard. White uniforms, not robes, were a part of their military attire. John D. Lee, one of Joseph's bodyguard, proudly wore his red sash in later years when he went to dances in southern Utah. Bennett's tales of Danites and angels were as nothing compared with his account of the moral decadence in Nauvoo. Joseph, he declared, had set up an elaborate system of prostitution for the special benefit of the church hierarchy. The Mormon women inducted into this system were divided into 3 classes. The lowest, called the Cyprian Saints, consisted of those warm-hearted, carelessly generous females who had been betrayed into an indiscretion and forced to confess, and who thereafter were designated as harridans for the church leaders. The second class, the Chambered Sisters of Charity, or Saints of the Green Veil, was composed of women somewhat less disposed to a free distribution of their charms, but still sufficiently prodigal to bestow them on occasion without benefit of a marriage ceremony. If a church official wished to win a chambered sister of charity, Bennett explained, he asked Joseph, who looked in his peepstone, and there inquired the will of heaven. If he desired the woman for himself, The answer was no. Most honored among the Nauvoo women, said Bennett, were the cloistered saints, or saints of the Black Veil, who went through a marriage ritual and became secret or spiritual wives. Joseph, he reported, had at least 7, but out of deference to their reputations, he listed them by initial only. See page 302. N. It is impossible to fudge the accuracy of Bennett's stories except where they are supplemented by more reliable data. There is no other reference to Cyprian saints, chambered sisters of charity, or cloistered saints in any available document. Yet the cloistered saints roughly corresponded to the system of plural wives Joseph had set up. Whether the others were Bennett's own secret ramifications of the plural wife system, or whether he simply made them up out of whole cloth to make his expose as lurid as possible, cannot be ascertained. Joseph's affections, he continued, ranged from the handsome Gentile whore who lived down by the steamboat landing, up through the scale of Nauvoo society to the fiery. Even married women were not immune to Joseph's importunities. There was Mrs. Sarah Pratt, wife of the Apostle Orson Pratt, then on a mission to England. Bennett said that he knew her well, having boarded at her house for some months, and he described her as one of the most elegant, graceful, amiable, and accomplished women in the place. Miss Pratt, he said, told him the full details of Joseph's conversation with her. After the appropriate preliminaries, the prophet said, "Sister Pratt, the Lord has given you to me as one of my spiritual wives. I have the blessings of Jacob granted me, as God granted holy men of old. And as I have long looked upon you with favor and an earnest desire of connubial bliss, I hope you will not repulse or deny me." Sarah is supposed to have replied in the following dignified language: "Am I called upon to break the marriage covenant and prove recreant to my lawful husband? I never will. My sex shall not be disgraced, nor my honor sullied. I care not for the blessings of Jacob, and I believe in no such revelations, neither will I consent under any circumstances whatever. I have one good husband, and that is enough for me." Joseph then threatened her, Bennett said, for he was fearful lest she spread the story. "But if you should tell, I will ruin your reputation. Remember that?" Mrs. Pratt never published a statement of her own, but in later years 2 men obtained interviews with her. One, Joseph Smith's eldest son, quoted her as saying, "No, Joseph, your father never said an improper word to me in his life. He knew better." There is no truth in the reports that have been circulated about him in this regard. He was always the Christian gentleman and a noble man. Memoirs of President Joseph Smith, Saints Herald, the 22nd of January, 1935, page 109. Weil, on the other hand, in Mormon Portraits, quoted her as mentioning Joseph's dastardly attempt on me, and there was serious trouble between the prophet and Orson Pratt after the latter's return from England. Mrs. Pratt was subjected to an intensive smear campaign, and the couple nearly left the church. Bennett bolstered his accusations with several body affidavits from Nauvoo prostitutes and 2 letters allegedly dictated by the prophet. One of these, the letter to Nancy Rigdon, he held Joseph to be the most consummate charlatan in the country, so steeped in trickery that he had become scornful of God and man alike. As evidence, he cited a request that Joseph supposedly made of him after they had become intimate friends. "Joe proposed to me to go to New York and get some plates engraved and bring them to him, so that he could exhibit them as the genuine plates of the Book of Mormon, which he pretended had been taken from him and hid up by an angel, and which he would profess to have recovered." He calculated upon making considerable money by this trick, as there would be great anxiety to see the plates, which he intended to exhibit at 25 cents a sight. I mentioned this proposition to Mrs. Sarah M. Pratt on the day the prophet made it, and requested her to keep it in memory, as it might be of much importance. When Miss Pratt was asked about this years later, she confirmed Bennett's story, but it may be that Bennett concocted it himself in order to slander the prophet at his most vulnerable point. C. W. Weil, Mormon Portraits, p. 21. Realizing that his own position was equivocal, Bennett prefaced his book with the statement that he had joined the Mormons only to expose them, and that he had pretended to great friendship with the prophet in order to lay bare his perfidy. The first 50 pages of his book were devoted to statements attesting the integrity of his own character. When the historian H.H. Bancroft read these, he commented with a nice irony, "When a man thrusts in your face 80 certificates of his good character by from 1 to a dozen persons, you may know that he is a very great rascal." To any discerning reader, Bennett revealed himself in his own book to be a base and ignoble opportunist. The New York Herald, after getting the full news value of the letters by republishing them as they appeared in the Sangamo Journal, loftily scorned Bennett's own collection, The History of the Saints, as obscene and licentious in the highest degree. Even the Whig press in Illinois, while exploiting the letters and book to the hilt as unexpected political capital, felt obliged to make reservations about the author's character. "We can hardly put reliance upon the statements of Bennett," said the Quincy Whig on the 16th of July, 1842. "They disclose so much wickedness." The Democratic press refused to publish any of Bennett's stories, scored the opposition for descending to political pornography, and called the whole scandal a Whig plot. The Illinois State Register on the 15th of July accused the Whig candidate for governor, Joseph Duncan, of publishing at his own expense thousands of copies of Bennett's obscene, vulgar, and immoral statements, and cried shame upon such panderers of licentiousness and moral depravity. Nevertheless, the Democrats were terribly shaken, and feared that Bennett had cost them the election. At this point, the Democrats ran into an unexpected piece of good luck. The sudden death of their candidate for governor, Adam Snyder, left the post open for a man who could stand completely aloof from the Mormon question. Since practically every leading political figure in the state had voted for the Mormon charters, this candidate was not easy to find. The party finally selected a sober, innocuous lawyer named Thomas Ford, then serving as a justice of the state Supreme Court. Though ostensibly no politician, Ford conducted a very shrewd campaign. "I have no means of knowing," he said in his speeches in regard to the Mormons, "whether, in point of fact, they intend to vote for me or Governor Duncan. I am so entirely ignorant of the Mormons that I do not know anything about them either in a religious, political, or moral point of view, and therefore I can neither defend nor condemn them. I neither seek nor reject them, but leave them free, like other people, to choose between my competitor and myself." Illinois State Register, the 1st of July, 1842. The Whigs tried desperately to prove that Ford had sold out to the prophet, but without success, since Ford even advocated repeal of the extraordinary powers granted in the Nauvoo Charter. By election time, the initial horror at Bennett's expose had spent itself, and the campaign of counter-accusation that Joseph Smith had energetically set in motion was beginning to take effect. Ford was elected, the Whig papers ceased their fulminations, and the state settled back into its old routine. But there was no return to routine in Nauvoo. Bennett had opened Pandora's box, and the most frantic efforts could not recapture all the furies that he loosed. It was the prophet's good fortune, however, that Bennett so egregiously overstated his case that it was possible to discredit him in the eyes of the Mormon people. Before many weeks, Joseph had made Bennett's name synonymous with licentiousness and betrayal. A WASP extra published on the 27th of July, 1842, declared him a spoiler of character and virtue and a living pestilence walking in darkness to fester in his own infamy, and a special pamphlet, affidavits and certificates disproving the statements and affidavits contained in John C. Bennett's letters denounced him for seduction, pandering, and abortion. Sarah Pratt and Nancy Rigdon here were publicly accused of being his mistresses. Non-Mormons were inclined to believe both Bennett's and Joseph's collections of affidavits, but within Nauvoo no one dared accuse Joseph of polygamy since it meant identifying him with Bennett. Rigdon was so outraged at the slander against his daughter that he published a statement calling Stephen Markham, who had linked Nancy's name with Bennett, a notorious liar. Yet he was so appalled at the proof of Bennett's degeneracy that he added his own denunciation of Bennett to those of the other church leaders and kept silent about Joseph's importunity. Rigdon's statement against Markham, dated the 3rd of September, 1842, was published in the Sangamo Journal, the 23rd of September, 1842. His denunciation of Bennett appeared in the WASP Extra, the 27th of July, 1842. Bennett had fully expected the Pratts and Rigdon to follow him out of the church, but in both instances he was disappointed. Pratt, who had some time since returned from England to teach mathematics at the University of Nauvoo, wandered about Nauvoo like a man bereft of sins, proclaiming the innocence of his wife to every passer-by. When William Law called upon the saints in a public meeting to acknowledge Joseph as a good, moral, virtuous, peaceable, and patriotic man, Pratt stood up, pale and lonely-looking among the thousands, to register the only negative vote, the Wasp Extra, the 17th of July, 1842. One morning he disappeared, and the whole of Nauvoo went out in search of him, for he was generally liked and admired. He was finally discovered miles below the town, sitting hatless on the bank of the Mississippi. Shorn of his apostleship, suspicious of friend and enemy alike, and tormented by doubts of Sarah's own denials, he had come very near suicide. But he stayed in Nauvoo, wrestling with his furies for 5 months, after which he was rebaptized with his wife in the Mississippi River. History of the Church, Volume 5, pages 138 to 56, and The Return, Volume 2, November 1890, page 362. Pratt eventually became the husband of 10 wives and the father of 45 children. In the seclusion of his home, Sidney Rigdon alternately sulked and prayed for many weeks. Then one day, pale and shaken, he mounted the platform in the grove to describe a miracle. His daughter, Eliza, he reported, after a brief illness had fallen into. The doctor had pronounced her dead and left the house, and the family had given way to its grief. But Eliza had risen from her bed, called the family around her, and lashed at Nancy with a message from heaven. "It is in your heart to deny this work, and if you do, the Lord says it will be the damnation of your soul." Bennett was a wicked man, she insisted, and the Lord was about to trample him underfoot. But if Nancy continued in the faith, she would be showered with divine blessings. After delivering this admonition, Rigdon continued, Eliza had swooned away. For hours she had hovered between life and death, while he had knelt at her bedside. Finally the Lord had healed her, and now he had come to testify that Joseph was a true and not a fallen prophet, and that he was truly chosen to build up the kingdom of God. History of the Church, Volume 5, pages 121 to 2. Eliza Rigdon's sensational experience, whatever it was, may have had psychological roots in a consuming jealousy of Nancy. At any rate, it saved the prophet a defection that might have been grave indeed, for if Bennett can be believed, Rigdon was at one time on the point of writing a book against his leader. Once again, Joseph had been saved by a miracle not of his making. For Joseph, one of the worst aspects of the Bennett scandal was that instead of preaching the new marriage order more and more openly, when he published the Udny Jacob pamphlet in an effort to stem the tide of revulsion against anything that hinted of matrimonial experimentation, it roused such a storm of indignation that he was obliged hastily to renounce it in Times and Seasons as an unmeaning rigmarole of nonsense, folly, and trash. Volume 4, the 1st of December, 1842, page 32. This and other public denials of spiritual wifism put a peculiar burden on his own wives, and also on the leading Mormon men who were beginning to practice polygamy. Joseph persuaded a dozen prominent elders to swear that none but the conventional marriage order existed in Nauvoo, and that Bennett's system was a creature of his own make. A similar statement was signed by a dozen important Mormon women, with Emma's name proudly at their head. But while Emma signed the affidavit in good faith, others unhappily perjured themselves. Among the signatories were Newell and Elizabeth Whitney, who but 3 months earlier had stood witness at the marriage of their 17-year-old daughter Sarah Ann to the prophet. The sworn statements were published in Times and Seasons, Volume 3, the 21st of October, 1842, pages 939 to 40. Sarah Ann Whitney was married to Joseph on the 27th of July, 1842. See Appendix C. Eliza Snow swore along with the rest, although she had been the prophet's wife since the 29th of June. A sensitive and high-minded woman, she must have been pained at this denial. She was living in Joseph's home, tutoring his children, as well as conducting a school, and was, next to Emma, the most beloved woman in Nauvoo. Children memorized her long didactic poems, which appeared regularly in Times and Seasons, and sang her hymns on the streets. Joseph had married her in the week of Bennett's expulsion, and gossip later had it that Emma had set her to spying on the prophet, and he had married her to keep her quiet. But Eliza Snow was the last woman in Nauvoo to stoop to spying on the man she revered as a god, and her autobiography makes it clear that she had been taught the principle of polygamy for some time before she entered it, although she hoped and believed that years would pass before it was actually practiced. Although she was as old as Emma, the years had dealt gently with her austere beauty. It is quite likely that Joseph had admired her for a long time, but because of her initial aversion to the concept of plural marriage, had not pressed his suit until Bennett's disclosures made it imperative that he take her into his full confidence. The denials of polygamy uttered by the Mormon leaders between 1835 and 1852, when it was finally admitted, are a remarkable series of evasions and circumlocutions involving all sorts of verbal gymnastics. When the brethren attacked spiritual wifism or polygamy, it was with the mental reservation that the patriarchal order of marriage, or celestial order of plurality of wives, was immeasurably different. The prophet's denials of polygamy were never as direct as those of his leading polygamist brethren. "There is a great noise in the city," he said in one address, "and many are saying there cannot be so much smoke without some fire. Well, be it so. If the stories about Joe Smith are true, then the stories of John C. Bennett are true about the ladies of Nauvoo. And he says that the Ladies' Relief Society are all organized of those who are to be the wives of Joe Smith. Ladies, you know whether this is true or not. It is no use living among hogs without a snout. This biting and devouring each other I cannot endure. Away with it. For God's sake, stop it." The 21st of February, 1843. History of the Church, Volume 5, page 286. Chapter 23. Into Hiding. In the spring of 1841, when Joseph was harassed by the threat of extradition to Missouri, he had said some bitter things. No scribe had recorded the speech in which he called down curses upon his persecutors, but the rumor got about that he had predicted that the hated Boggs would meet a violent death within a year, and that Governor Carlin would die in a ditch. Carlin reported this rumor back to Joseph in a letter dated the 30th of June, 1842. See History of the Church, Volume 5, page 50. When, therefore, in May 1842, word came to Nauvoo that Boggs had been shot by an unknown assailant, it went through the city as if a great prophecy had been fulfilled. According to Oliver Olney, who was then in Nauvoo, see his Absurdities of Mormonism Portrayed, page 19. A writer in the Wasp who signed himself Vortex commented indiscreetly on May 28th, "Boggs is undoubtedly killed according to report, but who did the noble deed remains to be found out." Certain observers in Nauvoo noted that Joseph's sinister bodyguard, Porter Rockwell, who had been absent for some weeks, returned to the city just 2 days after the news of the shooting. He admitted to friends that he had just come from Missouri. The Whig press, knowing the zeal of some of Joseph's men for making his prophecies come true, was quick to point the finger of suspicion, and insinuated that Joseph, the Mormon prophet, said the Quincy Whig on May 21st, as we understand, prophesied a year or so ago his death by violent means. Hence there is plenty of foundation for rumor. Joseph replied indignantly in the Wasp on May 28. Boggs was a candidate for the state senate, and, I presume, fell by the hands of a political opponent, with his hands and face yet dripping with the blood of murder. But he died not through my instrumentality. My hands are clean and my heart pure from the blood of all men. John C. Bennett wrote that he had heard the prophet offer a $500 reward to any destroying angel who would kill Boggs. At first Bennett said he had been certain that Porter Rockwell had been the assailant, for before his trip to Missouri he had been abjectly poor, and after his return he had an elegant carriage and horses at his disposal, and his pockets were filled with gold. But Joseph had insisted, Bennett continued, that the carriage and gold were furnished Rockwell to haul tourists to and from the steamboat to the temple. "The destroying angel has done the work, as I predicted," the prophet said, "but Rockwell was not the man who shot. The angel did it." Bennett was not content with accusing the prophet in print. Boggs had obstinately refused to die. though he had been hit 3 times in the head. As soon as he had sufficiently recovered, Bennett went to him with all that he knew and more that he imagined about the attempted assassination. Boggs promptly swore to an affidavit charging Joseph with being an accessory before the fact of the intended murder, and persuaded Governor Reynolds to ask for his extradition on the ground that he was a fugitive from justice. When the sheriffs arrived in Nauvoo on the 8th of August, 1842, armed with the writ and a warrant from Governor Carlin, both Joseph and Porter Rockwell submitted to arrest, but were released under a writ of habeas corpus issued by the Nauvoo Municipal Court. The City Council then passed an ordinance giving the Nauvoo Court power to inquire into the validity and legality of every writ or process served upon a Nauvoo citizen, and the right to dismiss it if the writ or process was found to have been issued either through private pique, malicious intent, or religious persecution, falsehood, or misrepresentation, printed in the Wasp, the 13th of August, 1842. Faced with this ordinance, which was an obvious infringement upon the powers of the state courts, the Missouri sheriffs went back to Governor Carlin for further instructions. Joseph had 1,000 witnesses to prove that he had been in Nauvoo on the day of the shooting, but he was certain that extradition to Missouri meant death, that he had no faith in the legality of the ordinance and used it only as a ruse to escape arrest, the sheriffs discovered upon their return. For Rockwell had secretly departed for Philadelphia, and Joseph had gone into hiding close to Nauvoo. For 4 months the prophet lived the uncertain, nerve-shattering existence of a fugitive from justice, with a handsome price. He hid in many places, from the secret bricked-in vault under the cellar steps of his home to the farm of a friend 2 days' journey north of Nauvoo. He usually traveled by skiff up and down the river at night, often landing for a time on an island to baffle possible pursuers. His friends launched rumors that he had gone to Washington, to Wisconsin, and even to Europe. But the sheriffs nevertheless made repeated visits to the city, hoping to catch him in one of his rare visits home. When he first went into hiding, Joseph sank into a pit of depression that threatened to suffocate him. He thought much about death, in that half-pleasant, half-grisly imagery that a young man associates with the grave, and planned an elaborate tomb on the riverbank, which, he wrote in his journal, must be called the Tomb of Joseph, a descendant of Jacob. Solitude and foreboding did not turn him to introspection, however. Although he submerged himself in his letters and journal, there was no self-communing, only rhetorical lament. O Lord God, my heavenly Father, shall it be vain that thy servant must needs be exiled from the midst of his friends, or be dragged from their bosoms to clank in cold and iron chains, to be thrust within the dreary prison walls, to spend days of sorrow and of grief and misery there by the hands of an infuriated, incensed, and infatuated foe, to glut their infernal and insatiable desire upon innocent blood, and for no other cause on the part of thy servant than for the defense of innocence. And thou, a just God, will not hear his cry? O no, thou wilt hear me, a child of woe. Mine enemies shall not prevail, they all shall melt like wax before thy face. History of the Church, Volume 5, page 128. Emma's first visit was a great comfort to him. The Bennett Expose had been a paralyzing shock to her, and he had not been sure what she would turn to in his absence. How glorious were my feelings, he wrote in his journal, when I met that faithful and friendly band on the night of the 11th on Thursday, on the island at the mouth of the slough between Zarahemla and Nauvoo. With what unspeakable delight and what transports of joy swelled my bosom when I took by the hand on that night my beloved Emma, she that was my wife, even the wife of my youth and the choice of my heart. Many were the reverberations of my mind when I contemplated for a moment the many scenes we had been called to pass through, the fatigues and the toils, the sorrows and sufferings, and the joys and consolations. Oh, what a commingling of thought filled my mind for the moment. Again she is here, even in the 7th trouble, undaunted, firm and unwavering, unchangeable, affectionate Emma. Ebidem, Volume 5, page 107. Emma was always first with Joseph, a steady, monumental presence, against which all the other wives were but lights and shadows. He accorded her what he believed to be all the rights of her position, complete domination of the children and the home, and even trusted her to transact considerable business for him. Occasionally he deferred to her in matters of decorum and propriety, but his affection now was largely nostalgic. It was the wife of his youth to whom he paid his own special kind of devotion. As an intellectual companion, she did not exist for him, nor did any woman. One of Joseph's rare references to Emma in his journal is as revealing of this as it is of the prophet's vanity. When she was serving dinner to him and Parley Pratt one day, he complained jocularly that she always loaded the table with too much good food. When Pratt suggested that he eat by himself like Napoleon, seated at a table with just the victuals he needed, Emma spoke up quickly, "But Mr. Smith is a bigger man than Bonaparte. He can never eat without his friends." Joseph looked up at her in pleased surprise. "That," he said, "is the wisest thing I ever heard you say." Exactly what happened between them when Bennett's letters first appeared one cannot know, but it is clear that she set herself determinedly against any intimation of her husband's disloyalty. She demanded denials, and got them. To these she clung with a desperate tenacity. For Emma was ridden with the helpless jealousy that comes to a woman growing unlovely with illness and childbearing while her husband remains maddeningly young, and she was proud. The thought of her sons growing up to discover one day that their father, for all his strange genius and spiritual insight, was a common libertine. For she never could see a polygamist as anything else was so nauseating that she thrust it from her, and for a long time closed her eyes to what she dared not see. While Joseph was in hiding, she must have found some measure of content, despite her terror lest he be captured, for their visits were frequent, and he wrote her tender and affectionate letters. She could not know that during the weeks he stayed in hiding at the farm of Edward Sayers, he persuaded Mrs. Sayers to join his circle of wives. See Appendix C. With the approach of winter, Joseph's maneuvering in and out of Nauvoo became increasingly difficult. He toyed with the idea of going to Wisconsin, but dismissed it after the inauguration of Thomas Ford as governor on the 8th of December 1842. Ford believed that the Missouri writ for Joseph's extradition was illegal and agreed to test it formally in an Illinois court if Joseph would give himself up for trial. Emma was now desperately ill, about to give birth to her 8th child, and the prophet was willing to risk anything for a little security. As soon as the baby came, and he knew that Emma would recover, he said that he would give himself up to the law. The boy was born the day after Christmas, 1842, and died almost immediately. Since Emma had never really ceased grieving after the bright-eyed little Don Carlos, and Joseph had prayed that the new baby would still her lament, the death was doubly bitter. Of her 8 children, only 3 had lived, and Emma felt cheated in her motherhood. Before leaving for Springfield, Joseph called at a neighbor's house where there were twin baby girls and said to the mother, "Sister McIntyre, I have come to borrow one of your babies. I want her for my wife to comfort her for a time." The baby was taken to Joseph's home by day, and at night was returned to her mother. And in nursing this child, Emma was freed of some of her desolation. Joseph, meanwhile, submitted to arrest, and set forth for Springfield with a retinue of 40 of his best soldiers, armed to the hilt with bright muskets and brighter bayonets. They stopped for the night in the village of Paris, only to be denied lodging at every inn they visited. Joseph argued good-naturedly at first, and then pleaded in deadly earnest, for a prairie gale was whipping through the streets, chilling his men to the marrow, and biting their fingers and faces with frost. Suspecting finally that the tavern owners had leagued together in an agreement to bar them, he insisted harshly, his face livid, "We must and will stay, let the consequence be what it might, for we must stay or perish." The landlord replied sullenly, "We have heard the Mormons are very bad people, and the inhabitants of Paris have combined not to have anything to do with them. We will stay," the prophet repeated in a tone that made the man turn pale, "but no thanks to you. I have men enough to take the town, and if we must freeze, we will freeze by the burning of these houses." The taverns were promptly opened. History of the Church, Volume 5, page 211. The company marched into Springfield the next day in a slow and solemn parade that caused a sensation among the citizens. "All were astounded at the course of the prophet in giving himself up," said one newspaper man. knowing full well that if the Missourians got hold of him, he would be gibbeted. The prophet is a large, portly, and fine-looking man, the writer continued. 6 feet without shoes, looks about 40 or 42, and weighs 220 pounds. Eyes light blue, approaching to gray, light brown hair, peaked nose, large head. I think of very little self-esteem, but more of the intellectual than the animal. Dressed in box coat, black blue dress coat and pants, black silk velvet vest, white cravat, a large gold ring on the finger next to the little one of his left hand, black cane, and wears a continual smile on his countenance. A dispatch from Springfield dated the 4th of January, New York Herald, the 18th of January, 1843. Actually, Joseph had just turned 37. Although technically under arrest, Joseph had complete freedom in the city and met the leading figures in the Illinois state government. His youth, affability, and distinguished appearance won the grudging admiration even of the Whig Party leaders, and the trial was rapidly transformed into a personal triumph. On New Year's Day, the House of Representatives was thrown open to Orson Hyde for a sermon on Mormonism, and Joseph was showered with invitations. James Adams, judge of the probate court of Sangamon County, who had long had an affection for Joseph and eventually was baptized into the church, insisted on his staying in his own home, though he had no other bed to offer than the living room sofa. He liked questioning this astonishing young man on everything from his principles of marriage to the state of the millennium, and applauded warmly when Joseph prophesied in the name of the Lord that he would not go to Missouri, dead or alive. When the decision was read on the 5th of January, 1843, the courtroom was crowded to the eaves. Judge Pope entered from the rear, accompanied by a half-dozen ladies whom he smilingly permitted to sit on the stand beside him. This good-humored mockery of the defendant was not lost on the crowd, which was as interested in the prophet's marital history as in his legal embarrassment. This case, the judge began after some preliminaries, presents the important question arising under the Constitution and laws of the United States, whether a citizen of the state of Illinois can be transported from his own state to the state of Missouri, to be there tried for a crime which, if he ever committed, was committed in the state of Illinois, whether he can be transported to Missouri as a fugitive from justice when he has never fled from that state. After a lengthy recital of the arguments, which revolved chiefly around the Boggs affidavit, the judge held the writ invalid and ordered Joseph discharged. The decision surprised no one. The prophet and his men went back to Nauvoo jubilant. John "Skunk" Bennett, as he was now popularly called, had done his worst, and Joseph had come off triumphant. In a great Thanksgiving celebration, he served a feast to 50 of his choicest friends. As a gesture of loyalty and humility, Emma and Joseph served the guests themselves, and the men and women accepted the food and drink as if it were a sacrament. When the meal was over, Joseph announced that he and Emma had been married 15 years to the day, whereupon there descended upon the couple such a hail of good wishes that they stood speechless with emotion. Emma must have felt vindicated at last from the aspersions of John Bennett, although, had she been in a mood for suspicion, the presence of Eliza Snow and Hannah Ells might very well have robbed her of some of the sweetness of this moment. If Joseph was cleared from involvement in the Boggs shooting, Porter Rockwell was not. He remained all winter in Philadelphia, lonely and penniless. Finally, he decided to risk a return to Nauvoo, and with brazen insouciance got off the steamboat at St. Louis for a look around the city. He was recognized, caught, and taken to prison in Independence. The most damaging evidence against him was Bennett's charge that Rockwell had said to him on the 5th of July, 1842, "If I shot Boggs, they have got to prove it. I never done an act in my life that I was ashamed of, and I do not fear to go anywhere that I have ever been, for I have done nothing criminal." Bennett's account of his interview with Rockwell was printed widely, and was republished in the Wasp, the 23rd of July, 1842. This was flimsy evidence upon which to hang a man, and let it be said to the credit of the Missouri courts that they found it wanting. Although Rockwell was kept in prison 9 months, part of the time in irons, he was eventually released. The grand jury never indicted him, no doubt for lack of evidence. He escaped from jail, was recaptured, and was indicted for breaking jail. Tried on this charge in November, he was found guilty and sentenced to 5 minutes confinement in the county jail. Smith, The Mormon Troubles in Missouri, Missouri Historical Review, Volume 4, July 1910, pages 238-251, which prints the court record. However, Rockwell may well have been guilty, for he later boasted of the Boggs shooting, and his subsequent career as henchman for Brigham Young did not exactly establish a red. William Hall, who was a Mormon during the Nauvoo years, later wrote, "I heard him afterward boast of his exploits in shooting Boggs. The Abominations of Mormonism Exposed, Cincinnati, 1852, p. 30. W. Weil interviewed General Connor, who had employed Rockwell one winter in Utah. Connor reported that Rockwell admitted the Boggs shooting. "I shot through the window," said he, "and thought I had killed him, but I had only wounded him. I was damned sorry that I had not killed the son of a Ba." Mormon Portraits, page 255. See Charles Kelly. Holy Murder, New York, 1934, for Rockwell's later exploits. But whether Joseph ordered the deed will always be debatable. Certainly he had nothing to gain by it but trouble. Since Boggs was no longer in power, there could have been no serious motive but revenge, and Joseph was not a vengeful man. If he dispatched Rockwell to fulfill his own prophecy, he must then likewise have planned the murder of Thomas Carlin, and the twin deeds would have been an invitation to the destruction of his whole people. But Joseph seemed content to christen one of his horses Tom Carlin, and joke about riding the governor whenever he wanted to provoke a grin. Yet it should be noted that Joseph Jackson, one of the less savory characters Joseph Smith had in his employ for a time, confessed that the prophet in 1843 had offered him $3,000 to release Porter and kill old Boggs. And William Law, second counselor to Joseph in the Nauvoo years, in his old age swore to an affidavit that said in part, quote, "Joseph told me that he sent a man to kill Governor Boggs of Missouri. The fellow shot the governor in his own house." Quote, this he later repeated in an interview with W. Weil. "Let me tell you that Joe Smith told me the fact himself. The words were substantially like this. I sent Rockwell to kill Boggs, but he missed him. It was a failure. He wounded him instead of sending him to hell." Law's affidavit, sworn the 17th of July, 1885, remained unpublished and in the possession of Zenas H. Gurley, a founder of the reorganized church, until 1914. Then it was published by Charles A. Shook in True Origin of Mormon Polygamy, pages 125-9. Will's interview was published in the Salt Lake Tribune and reprinted in Thomas Gregg, The Prophet of Palmyra, New York, 1890, page 505. For Jackson's statement, see Narrative of the Adventures and Experiences of Joseph H. Jackson, Warsaw, Illinois, 1844, page 7. Bennett and Jackson are unreliable witnesses, to say the least, but Law was a man of integrity. Still, it is odd that he waited 40 years to accuse Joseph of inciting the Boggs shooting, since he laid many other crimes at the prophet's door when he left the church in 1844. It is possible, of course, that Bennett's and Jackson's accusations were pure fabrication, and Law's two statements merely a distortion of memory built up through years of bitter feeling against the church. If so, it is still not difficult to understand Rockwell's motivation for the crime. As literal-minded as Brigham Young, he might easily have reasoned that fulfilling Joseph's prophecies should be the business of the saints, since the Lord could not always be depended upon. Or he may simply have taken it upon himself to avenge the Mormon wrongs, regarding it as a public service. Perhaps he was out of favor, and hoped thus to reinstate himself. At any rate, he received no censure. When he returned to Nauvoo in December 1843, Rockwell was. His hair hung down to his shoulders, black and stringy like a witch's. His clothes were filthy and tattered, his shoes in shreds. It was night when he rode across the river, and he went directly to Joseph's sumptuous new home, the Mansion House, where a dancing party was in progress. With a keen relish for practical jokes, Rockwell pushed his way past the guard with an oath and made for the prophet, muttering imprecations and pretending to be drunk. Taking him for a Missourian, Joseph began to scuffle with him, and was ready to pitch him headlong out into the night when he got a good look at the man's face. "It's Porter!" he shouted, and began thumping him on the back with joy. The women stopped screaming, the guards put away their bowie knives, and Rockwell became the lion of the evening. Laughing at his long hair, Joseph promised him that if he kept it long like Samson and lived faithful to the church, his enemies should have no power over him. Accepting this promise as the Lord's word, Porter heeded it to the end of his life. See History of the Church, Volume 6, page 134, and James Jepson, Jr., Memories and Experiences, Miss, a copy of which is in the Utah State Historical Society Library. Jepson's parents were at this party. See also Harold Schindler's excellent biography, Porter Rockwell, Man of God, Son of Thunder, Salt Lake City, 1966. Joseph had not been long in the mansion house before he transformed it into a hotel, for he was weary of entertaining at his own expense a never-ending stream of curiosity seekers. His own family occupied spacious upstairs quarters, and the huge living room below was turned into a lobby and dining hall. Some weeks after Rockwell's return, Emma went to St. Louis to purchase furnishings. She returned to find in one corner of the lobby a well-equipped bar, with Rockwell, his hair neatly braided and tied with a ribbon, polishing glasses and dispensing whiskey. "Joseph, what is the meaning of that bar in this house?" she cried with a passion that startled her oldest son, who had never heard his parents quarrel. Joseph was ready with arguments. Porter was penniless. He deserved much consideration for his 9 months in a Missouri jail. His acquittal was of immeasurable aid to them all. Moreover, the bar was temporary and would be transferred to the barber shop then under construction across the street. "How does it look," she asked witheringly, "for the spiritual head of a religious body to be keeping a hotel which has a room fitted out as a liquor-selling establishment?" He reminded her that all taverns had bars, and while it was true that no grog shops were permitted in Nauvoo, there must be some place where distinguished travelers could be permitted the refreshment to which they were accustomed. The Nauvoo City Council had passed an ordinance giving him the sole right to dispense liquor in his hotel, and who better could be trusted with such a monopoly? "Well, Joseph," Emma said quietly when she had heard him through, "the furniture and other goods I have purchased for the house will come, and you can have some other person look after things here. As for me, I will take my children and go across to the old house and stay there, for I will not have them raised up under such conditions as this arrangement imposes upon us, nor have them mingle with the kind of men who frequent such a place. You are at liberty to make your choice. Either that bar goes out of the house, or we will." "Very well, Emma," Joseph answered immediately. "I will have it removed at once." And he did. This dialogue is related in the Sun's narrative, Memoirs of President Joseph Smith, Saints Herald, the 22nd of January, 1935, page 110. See also History of the Church, Volume 6, pages 111, 420. Chapter 24, The Wives of the Prophet. Probably no one will ever know exactly how many women Joseph Smith married. Brigham Young said quite frankly to William Hepworth Dixon in 1866, "I myself sealed dozens of women to Joseph." One Mormon historian drew up a list of 27 wives, but it is clear from all the available published and manuscript records that the number may have reached or even exceeded 50. See William Hepworth Dixon, New America, Philadelphia, 1867, page 225. Andrew Jensen, formerly assistant historian of the Utah Mormon Church, listed 27 wives in the Historical Record, Volume 6, May 1887, but he gave only the barest details, usually listing them by their maiden names and seldom providing documentation. It is clear that he did not even canvass all the Mormon sources, for he omitted several wives mentioned later by Orson F. Whitney in his Life of Heber C. Kimball, and many other wives listed in the Nauvoo Temple Record. In the accompanying list, question marks indicate where the data are doubtful. For complete documentation on every wife, see Appendix C. In January 1846, 18 months after his death, 30 women were sealed to the prophet for eternity in the Nauvoo Temple, and to various other men for time. Since it is clear from other records that more than 2/3 of these women had already been married to Joseph during his lifetime, it can be assumed that for all 30 women the sealing was simply a new solemnization of an earlier ceremony. It was felt that a marriage for eternity was not truly binding unless sanctified within the temple, which had not been completed in Joseph's lifetime. In later years in Utah, scores of women were sealed to the prophet posthumously, but since it is impossible to determine how many of these had been married to him during his lifetime, they are not included here. The following list, therefore, is possibly incomplete. It contains, however, the names of several women whose relationship to the prophet is admittedly little more than presumable. The first 36 wives listed here are arranged in the approximate chronological order of their marriage to Joseph Smith. The remainder, where no marriage date can even be guessed at, are listed alphabetically. Since for most of these latter the date of birth is available, and since Joseph married most of his wives during 1843 and 1844, it is possible to suggest the approximate age of each woman when married. Point 1. Emma Hale, 22, the 18th of January, 1827. 2. Fanny Alger, 17, 1836. 3. Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris, wife of G.W. Harris, 37, 1838. 4. Prescindia Huntington Buell, wife of Norman Buell, 29, 1839. 5. Nancy Marinda Johnson Hyde, wife of Orson Hyde, 24, 1839. 6. Clarissa Reed Hancock, wife of Levi W. Hancock, 35, 1847. Louisa Beeman, 26, the 5th of April, 1841. 8. Zena Diantha Huntington Jacobs, wife of Henry B. Jacobs, 20, the 27th of October, 1842. 9. Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, wife of Adam Leitner, 24, the 1st of February, 84,210. Patty Bartlett Sessions, wife of David Sessions, 47, the 9th of March, 1842. 11. Delsina Johnson Sherman, widow of Lyman R. Sherman, 36, before the 1st of June, 84,212. Mrs. Durfee, before the 1st of June, 84,213. Sally Ann Fuller Gully, wife of Samuel Gully, 26, before the 1st of June, 84,214. Mrs. A. S. before the 1st of June, 84,215. Miss B. before the 1st of June, 84,216. Eliza Roxy Snow, 38, the 29th of June, 183,217. Sarah Ann Whitney, 17, the 27th of July, 1842. 18. Sarah M. Kinsley, Cleveland, wife of John Cleveland, 54, 1842. 19. Elvira A. Cowles, 29, before the 1st of December, 84,220. Martha McBride, 38, Summer, 184,221. Ruth D. Vos Sayers, wife of Edward Sayers, 34, the 1st of August, 84,222. Desdemona Wadsworth Fulmer, 33, 184,223. Emily Dow Partridge, 19, the 4th of March, 1843, 24. Eliza M. Partridge, 23, the 1st of March, 84,325. Almera Woodward Johnson, 31, the 1st of April, 84,326. Lucy Walker, 17, May, 1,184, 327. Helen Marr Kimball, 15, May, 184,328. Maria Lawrence, 19, Spring, 184,329. Sarah Lawrence, 17, Spring, 184,330. Flora Ann Woodworth, 16, Spring, 184,331. Rhoda Richards, 59, the 12th of June, 1843. Hannah Ells, 32nd, 1843. 33. Melissa Lott, 19, the 20th of September, 1843. 34. Fanny Young Murray, wife of Roswell Murray, 56, the 2nd of November, 1843. 35. Olive Gray Frost, 27 to 8, after the 1st of April, 84,336. Mary Ann Frost Pratt, wife of Parley P. Pratt, 34 to 5. After the 1st of April, 84,337. Olive Andrews, 25 to 6, 1,843 to 4. 38. Mrs. Blossom, wife of Edward Blossom. Elizabeth Davis, 52 to 3, 1,843 to 4. 40. Mary Houston, 25 to 6, 1,843 to $4. 41. Vienna Jacques, 55 to 6, 1,843 to 4. 42. Cordelia Callista Morley, 20 to 1, 1,843 to 4. 43. Sarah Scott, 44. Sylvia Sessions, 25 to 6, 1,843 to 4. 45. Nancy Maria Smith. 46. Jane Tibbetts, 39 to 40, 1,843 to 4. 47. Phoebe Watrous, 38 to 9, 1,800. 48. Nancy Maria Winchester, 15 to 16, 1,843 to 4. 29. Sophia Woodman, 48 to 9, 1,843 to 4. It will be seen that at least 12 were married women with living husbands, although the evidence for Mrs. Levi Hancock is only word-of-mouth tradition in the Hancock family. The ages of Joseph's wives varied all the way from the 15 years of Helen Mar Kimball, daughter of Heber Kimball, to the 59 years of Rhoda Richards, spinster sister of Joseph's secretary Willard Richards. The prophet married 5 pairs of sisters, Delsina and Almera Johnson, Eliza and Emily Partridge, Sarah and Maria Lawrence, Mary Ann and Olive Greyfrost, and Prescindia and Zena Huntington. Patty and Sylvia Sessions were mother and daughter. The majority of the prophet's wives fall into 3 general categories. First, the group of married women to whom Joseph was sealed between 1838 and the expulsion of Bennett in June 1842, and second, the leading women in the Nauvoo Relief Society who were married to the prophet during the furor that followed Bennett's departure. The third group consists of the dozen or more unmarried women whom he married in the spring and summer of 1843. Most of them were quite young. Helen Mar Kimball was 15. Nancy Maria Winchester, who may be identical with Nancy Maria Smith, was 15 or 16. Lucy Walker, Sarah Lawrence, and Flora Ann Woodworth were 17. Maria Lawrence and Melissa Lott were 19. 6 of the girls Joseph took as wives lived at various times as wards in his own home. These were the Partridge sisters, the Lawrence sisters, Eliza R. Snow, and Lucy Walker. One of these, the 17-year-old Lucy Walker, who had moved into the prophet's home after the death of her mother, described Joseph's whirlwind courtship. She thereby revealed not only her own ingenuousness, but also Joseph's sophistication. Late in April 1843, Emma Smith went to St. Louis to make purchases for the mansion house, accompanied by Lucy's brother, Loren Walker, who was one of Joseph's business aides. During their absence, Joseph asked Lucy to become his wife. "I have no flattering words to offer," he told her after the usual preliminaries. "It is a command of God to you. I will give you until tomorrow to decide this matter. If you reject this message, the gate will be closed forever against you." This, she said, aroused every drop of Scotch in my veins. For a few moments I stood fearless before him and looked him in the eye. I felt at this moment that I was called to place myself upon the altar, a living sacrifice, perhaps to brook the world in disgrace and incur the displeasure and contempt of my youthful companions. "Although you are a prophet of God," she told him, "you could not induce me to take a step of so great importance unless I knew that God approved my course. I would rather die." He walked across the room, returned, and stood before her with what she described as the most beautiful expression of countenance, and said, "God Almighty bless you. You shall have a manifestation of the will of God concerning you, a testimony that you can never deny. I will tell you what it shall be. It shall be that joy and peace that you never knew." "Oh, how earnestly I prayed for these words to be fulfilled," Lucy said. "It was near dawn after another sleepless night when my room was lighted up by a heavenly influence. To me it was, in comparison, like the brilliant sun bursting through the darkest cloud. My soul was filled with a calm, sweet peace that I never knew. Supreme happiness took possession of me, and I received a powerful and irresistible testimony of the truth of plural marriage. Emma Smith and Loren Walker returned from St. Louis on May 2. Lucy and Joseph had been married on May 1. Many Mormons have believed that Joseph's marriages were entirely spiritual, with consummation left to the eternal state. And with some of his wives, this was no doubt the case. Vienna Jacques, Rhoda Richards, Mrs. Sarah Cleveland, and Mrs. Fanny Young Murray, sister of Brigham Young, were all over 50. Some of the leaders of the Relief Society, whom he seems to have married chiefly for reasons of security, were probably married only for eternity. Elvira Cowles, treasurer of the Relief Society, who was sealed to Joseph probably early in 1842, was publicly married to Jonathan H. Holmes the following December, with the prophet performing. But with most of his wives, plural marriage meant for Joseph exactly what it meant later for all the polygamists in Utah: marriage for time, that is life, and eternity, with all connubial privileges. This is clearly indicated by many of the sworn statements of the wives, and especially by an unpublished manuscript by Joseph's friend Benjamin F. Johnson. Johnson described the prophet's courtship of his sister Almera in some detail, concluding with these words: "She stood by the prophet's side and was sealed to him as a wife by Brother William Clayton, after which the prophet asked me to take my sister to occupy number 10 in his mansion home during her stay in the city. But as I could not be long absent from my home and business, we soon returned to Ramles, where, on the 15th day of May, some 3 weeks later, the prophet again came, and at my house occupied the same room and bed with my sister that the month previous he had occupied with the daughter of the late Bishop Partridge as his wife." For Johnson's statement, see Appendix C. Joseph's journal entry for May 1, 1843 reports a visit to Ramus and his spending the night with the family of Benjamin F. Johnson. History of the Church, Volume 5, pages 391-2. Sometime during the spring of 1843, Joseph succeeded in convincing M. Like many a Mormon wife after her, she agreed reluctantly to let her husband have more wives if she could do the choosing. There were 4 young girls living with them at the time, under Joseph's guardianship, the Partridge sisters, Eliza and Emily, he had taken in after the death of their father, and after their legacy had been considerably reduced by his borrowing $10,000 from the estate. See footnote, page 266 above. The other 2, Sarah and Maria Lawrence, were young Canadian orphans, 17 and 19, who had brought to Nauvoo an inheritance of $8,000 in English gold. After much bitter hesitation, Emma selected Emily and Eliza Partridge, now respectively 19 and 23, and the ceremony was performed on May 11, 1843. Emma had no idea that these girls had already been married to Joseph some 2 months earlier. To save family trouble, Emily wrote ingenuously, Brother Joseph thought it best to have another ceremony performed. Joseph's entry in his journal for the date of these marriages indicates that he bought Emma a new carriage, but it was small solace to her. From that very hour, however, Emily later wrote, Emma was our bitter enemy. We remained in the family until several months after this, but things went from bad to worse until we were obliged to leave the house and find another home. Emma desired us to leave the city. Apparently Emma consented also to Joseph's marriage to the Lawrence sisters, but this was the limit of her sacrifice. She set herself stubbornly against any additions, and though she may have feared that there were others, she could not have dreamed how many. Since she was too discreet to voice her bitterness openly, the prophet's home seemed to the casual visitor to be harmony itself. Travelers who stayed at the mansion house universally acclaimed her serenity and poise. Sister Emma, Charlotte Haven wrote back to New England, is very plain in her personal appearance, though we hear she is very intelligent and benevolent, has great influence with her husband, and is generally beloved. She said very little to us, her whole attention being absorbed in what Joseph was saying. Joseph, she added, talked incessantly about himself, what he had done and could do more than other mortals, and remarked that he was a giant, physically and mentally. A Girl's Letters from Nauvoo, Overland Monthly, December 1890, page 623. Only Joseph's intimates knew that Emma nagged at him incessantly to be done with plural marriage. As the months went by, the group of friends in whom she could confide narrowed to none, as one by one they turned cold and deaf to her complaints. Occasionally she expressed her bitterness to Joseph's second counselor, William Law, whom she knew to be unalterably opposed to polygamy. He could do little to comfort her, knowing too well the sensual delight Joseph took in some of his younger wives. See William Law's affidavit, formerly in the possession of Zenas H. Gurley and published by Charles A. Shook in True Origin of Mormon Polygamy, pages 126-7. See also Weil's interview with William Law, published in Gregg, Prophet of Palmyra, page 508. Hiram Smith, who had several wives himself and did not have his brother's difficulties with the first, urged Joseph repeatedly to write down the revelation on celestial marriage. "I will take it and read it to Emma," he said one day in renewing the argument, "and I believe I can convince her of its truth, and you will hereafter have peace." Joseph replied with a wry smile, "You do not know Emma as well as I do." Before the afternoon was spent, however, he sat down and dictated to his secretary William Clayton the fast and most epic-making revelation of his life. All that he had been thinking and dreaming over the past years, everything that he had conceived about heaven and hell and sex, which he had never before dared commit to paper, he now dictated in a great rush. After a long justification of polygamy on biblical grounds, he went to the heart of the matter in a special commandment to Emma to receive all those that have been given unto my servant Joseph, and to cleave unto my servant Joseph, and to none else. The penalty for her disobedience was savage. But if she will not abide this commandment, she shall be destroyed, saith the Lord. For I am the Lord thy God, and will destroy her if she abide not in my law. But if she will abide this commandment, then shall my servant Joseph do all things for her, even as he hath said. And I will bless him, and multiply him, and give him 100-fold in this world, of fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, houses and lands, wives and children, and crowns of eternal lives in the eternal worlds. Then followed a concise statement of the new law. If any man espouse a virgin, and desire to espouse another, and the first give her consent, and if he espouse the second, and they are virgins, and have vowed to no other man, then he is justified. He cannot commit adultery, and if he have 10 virgins given unto him by this law, he cannot commit adultery, for they belong to him. Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. Hiram took the revelation to Emma, and returned some time later, angry and crestfallen. In all his life, he said, he had never been so abused by a woman. When Joseph had heard him through, he remarked quietly, "I told you didn't know Emma as well as I did." The story of the writing of the revelation was told by William Clayton in a sworn statement in 1874. See Historical Record, Volume 6, page 224-6. Joseph gave the revelation to Newell K. Whitney, who turned it over to Joseph C. Kingsbury with orders to make a copy. Brigham Young obtained this copy from Whitney in 1846. It was first published in a Deseret News Extra, the 14th of September, 1852. The Reorganized Church believes that the revelation was modified by Brigham Young, who is said to have introduced all the polygamous arguments. Quite aside from the testimonies of numerous Utah Mormons who heard it read in Nauvoo and later swore that it was published unchanged, there are statements made by men who did not follow Brigham Young that should be sufficient to remove any doubt on this point. See the affidavit of Leonard Sobey, the 14th of November, 1883, published in D. H. Bay's Doctrines and Dogmas of Mormonism, page 381, and that of William Law in his interview with W. Willey in Thomas Gregg, the Prophet of Palmyra, page 510. Although she stormed at Hiram, Emma was terribly shaken by the sight of the manuscript. Sorrowfully, she said to William Law, "The revelation says I must submit or be destroyed. Well, I guess I'll have to submit." As reported by Law to W. Weil, see Gregg, the Prophet of Palmyra, page 510. But with the passing days, she grew more courageous. However inspired the revelations of the past may have been, she felt in her heart that this was a concoction of John C. Bennett and the devil. According to Heber Kimball, Emma now threatened to leave her husband altogether. The journal history in the Mormon Church Library in Salt Lake City states that Kimball asserted this in a speech in Salt Lake the 12th of July, 1857. Joseph's mother, who came to live with them about this time, apparently took Emma's part. "I have never seen a woman in my life Lucy wrote in 1845, who would endure every species of fatigue and hardship from month to month and from year to year with that unflinching courage, zeal, and patience which she has ever done. For I know that which she has had to endure. She has been tossed upon the ocean of uncertainty. She has breasted the storms of persecution, and buffeted the rage of men and devils, which would have borne down almost any other woman. Biographical Sketches, page 169. There was a hard core of resistance in Emma that Joseph. She pleaded with him and badgered him, threatening and weeping, until finally he brought the revelation home and gave it to her. She dropped it in the fireplace, put a candle to it, and watched with grim satisfaction the long foolscap pages turn to curling, fragile bits of ash. The burning was a purely symbolic victory. Joseph had had a copy made, which he had every intention of showing about freely to his friends, but this at least was an end to argument on his part, and to tears on hers. Never again would he humiliate her by asking her to stand witness to a ceremony of wife-taking, nor would he even discuss plural marriage in her presence. She, on the other hand, would never acknowledge one of her husband's wives, though they reached the hundredfold suggested by the revelation. Although she could no longer hope to restore the core of a normal family relationship, at least the shell would be preserved intact. Since the polygamy revelation had threatened destruction to any wife who refused to accept the new law, the more literal-minded of the brethren, knowing Emma's attitude, fully expected her to be blasted by the Lord. Brigham Young, who had never been comfortable in Emma's presence, swore that she will be damned as sure as she is a living woman. But to this kind of talk Joseph replied with a warmth that stopped the critics' mouths. I will have her in the hereafter if I have to go to hell for her. See Brigham Young's sermon of the 9th of August, 1874, Journal of Discourses, Volume 17, 1875, page 159. Young here described also the scene where Emma burned the revelation. The news that a revelation on plural marriage had finally been put into writing whipped through the chain of underground gossip in Nauvoo. On the 12th of August, 1843, Joseph asked Hiram to read the text of it to the members of the High Council. William Marks, the president, Austin Cowles, whose daughter was one of Joseph's wives, and Leonard Sobey were the only men among the 12 present who opposed it, but they fought with such vigor that they put the whole council in confusion. Gradually, the church hierarchy became divided into a polygamist and anti-polygamist faction, with William Law championing the minority. Emma worked quietly against polygamy among the women. Your husbands are going to take more wives, she warned, and unless you consent to it, you must put your foot down and keep it there. As reported in a sworn statement by Bathsheba W. Smith, wife of George A. Smith, see Joseph F. Smith, Junior Blood Atonement and the Origin of Plural Marriage, page 88. Incredible as it may seem, the bulk of the Mormon colony, which now numbered more than 15,000 in and about the city, knew little or nothing of polygamy. In particular, the English converts, now numbering over 4,000 in Nauvoo, were kept in ignorance. No one could have been insulated from the gossip about spiritual wifeism, but the majority accepted the word of the church leaders that this system had disappeared with the expulsion of John C. Bennett. Charlotte Haven wrote home in girlish horror on the 8th of September, 1843, that Apostle Adams had returned from a mission to England with a new wife and child, and had persuaded his first wife to accept her. I cannot believe, she concluded, that Joseph will ever sanction such a doctrine. A Girl's Letters from Nauvoo, Overland Monthly, December 1890, page 635. Joseph added to the bewilderment and disbelief within Nauvoo by summarily excommunicating anyone caught preaching or practicing polygamy without his sanction. There is never but one on earth at a time on whom the power and its keys are conferred, he wrote, and I have constantly said no man shall have but one wife at a time unless the Lord directs otherwise. History of the Church, Volume 6, page 46. Harrison Sagers was brought to trial on the 13th of April, 1844, for preaching spiritual wife doctrine, and Hiram Brown was cut off from the church for preaching polygamy and other false and corrupt doctrines. See Times and Seasons, the 1st of February, 1844, and History of the Church, Volume 6, page 333. While there was confusion and doubting within Nauvoo, the anti-Mormons in neighboring Warsaw were universally convinced that polygamous marriages honeycombed the church. On the 7th of February, 1844, the Warsaw Message published a 13-stanza poem called Buckeye's Lamentation for Want of More Wives, which showed that the contents of the revelation were practically public property. I once thought I had knowledge great, but now I find 'tis small. I once thought I'd religion too, but now I find I've none at all. For I have but one lone wife, and can obtain no more. And the doctrine is, I can't be saved, unless I've half a score. A tenfold glory that's the prize. Without it you are undone, but with it you will shine as bright as the bright shining sun. There you may shine like mighty gods, creating worlds so fair, at least a world for every wife that you take with you there. None of Joseph's plural wives ever publicly acknowledged having conceived a child by him, which is not surprising in view of the natural delicacy of the subject and the overwhelming secrecy that has clouded the vital statistics of polygamous marriages throughout the whole of Mormon history. Very little information about the wives would now be available for publication, were it not for the fact that it was solicited by Utah church leaders in later years to answer the stubborn argument of Joseph's eldest son, who founded a separatist church based largely on the contention that his father had no wife but Emma. There is some evidence that Fanny Alger bore Joseph a child in Kirtland. And as we have seen, young Oliver Buell, born in 1839 or 1840 to Prescindia Huntington Buell, may well have been his son. One writer claimed that Prescindia's sister, Zena, conceived a child by the prophet while her husband, Henry B. Jacobs, was on a mission to England. If so, the child must have died in infancy. Legend among the descendants of Levi W. Hancock points to another son of the prophet. If the legend is true, the child was probably John Reed Hancock, born the 19th of April, 1841, in Nauvoo. Oddly, the next Hancock child, born considerably after Joseph Smith's death, was named Levison, as if to satisfy any doubt that Levi Hancock was in truth the father. Mrs. Mary Rollins Lightner, who was married to Joseph in February 1842, bore a son in 1843 who may as easily have been the prophet's son as that of Adam Lightner. Lightner carried his wife away from Nauvoo several months after her marriage to Joseph. He never joined the church. Mrs. Orson Hyde bore two sons in Nauvoo, Orson Washington on the 9th of November, 1843, and Frank Henry on the 23rd of January, 1845. These boys could have been Joseph's sons. Moroni Pratt, son of Mrs. Parley P. Pratt, born the 7th of December, 1844, might also be added to this list. For complete documentation on all of these children, see Appendix C. Of the 6 wives who lived for long periods in the mansion house, apparently only the 39-year-old poetess Eliza Snow conceived a child. She, as well as Emma, it seems, was pregnant in the spring of 1844. Eliza must have been torn between dread of the consequences and exultation at the prospect of facing the world, the mother of a prophet's son. It so happened that her bedroom in the mansion house was to the left of Joseph's, Emma's being on the right. According to tradition in the Snow family, Eliza emerged one morning at the same moment as Joseph, and he caught her to him in a quick embrace. At this instant, Emma opened her own door, and in a sudden, terrible rage, for apparently she had trusted Eliza above all other women, seized a broomstick and began beating her. Eliza tried to flee, stumbled, and fell down the full flight of stairs. Still not content, Emma pursued her in a frenzy that Joseph was powerless to stop, and drove her out of the house in her nightdress. By this time the whole mansion house was awake, young Joseph and Alexander weeping and frightened at their mother's hysteria, and begging her to be kind to the Aunt Eliza they adored. Joseph finally calmed his wife, and indignantly ordered her to restore Eliza to her room and rights in the household. The fall, it is said, resulted in a miscarriage. After Joseph's death, Eliza married Brigham Young, but bore him no children. Considering that of the 50 or more women Joseph married, all except 4 or 5 were young enough to bear children, and at least 18 were in their teens or 20s, many of whom later bore large families, it is astonishing that evidence of other children than these has never come to light. The fact that after the Fanny Alger scandal, Joseph for a long time deliberately and almost exclusively selected married women would indicate an overwhelming desire to avoid a repetition of that kind of trouble at least. Even the faithful Jedediah Grant felt the necessity of excusing the fact that Joseph took so many married women. Did the prophet Joseph want every man's wife he asked for? He did not. The grand object in view was to try the people of God to see what was in them. Journal of Discourses, Volume 2, 1855, page 14. But once Joseph started in earnest marrying the virgins prescribed by the revelation, it would seem that he flung caution to the winds. Perhaps he had learned some primitive method of birth control from the sophisticated Bennett, who had been a professor of midwifery as well as an abortionist. Robert Dale Owen and Charles Knowlton, the first great exponents in America of birth control, had published in the early 30s their famous tracts Moral Physiology and Fruits of Philosophy, or the Private Companion of Young Married People. Thousands of copies had been sold. While the methods these tracts detailed were by no means infallible, they were based on respectable medical science and not witchcraft. See Norman E. Haynes, Medical History of Contraception, Baltimore, 1936. Bennett must certainly have been familiar with these publications, or Joseph might simply have taken advantage of the frank advertisements in the New York Herald and other papers for such items as Portuguese female pills, the wonder and admiration of the world, which, however, must not be used during pregnancy as they are certain to produce miscarriage during that period, Dr. Conver's Minerva Box, Scent Without Exposure, or Madame Restel's Preventive Powders. The only mild, safe, and efficacious remedy for married ladies whose health forbids a too rapid increase of family. It may be that evidence of other children born to Joseph lies buried among the manuscripts in the church library in Salt Lake City, which the Mormon authorities originally were unwilling to publish out of deference to the women themselves, who would naturally resent having their intimate secrets exposed to Gentile mockery. And now that polygamy among the majority of the Mormons is dead, the leaders are not anxious to re-emphasize the fact that their prophet practiced it. Certainly they are eager to forget the magnificent immoderation with which he fulfilled the new marriage covenant. For once Joseph had succeeded to his own satisfaction in revolutionizing the Puritan concept of sin, there was no stop. Chapter 25. Candidate for President. Excitement has become almost the essence of my life, Joseph Smith declared in a sermon in May 1843. When that dies away, I feel almost lost. When a man is reined up continually by excitement, he becomes strong and gains power and knowledge. If life during these weeks had been barren of adventure, despite the fact that he was marrying wives at a faster rate than ever before, his inertia and placidity were to be short-lived. For John C. Bennett, who had continued to hound the prophet, was plotting with Lilburn Boggs in Missouri to extradite Joseph with a writ which no Illinois court could touch. In June 1843, he persuaded Governor Reynolds to issue a writ on the now 4-year-old treason charge from which Joseph had fled in 1839. Once the prophet was safely jailed in Missouri, Reynolds planned to try him for the Boggs shooting as well. The Missouri sheriffs, hand-picked for the delicate task of capturing the prophet, waited until he went unescorted on a preaching tour. Disguising themselves and pretending to be Mormon elders, they learned that he was staying near Dixon, Illinois. They caught him alone, forced him at gunpoint into a wagon, and without bothering with the formality of serving a process, whipped their horses toward Dixon. Stephen Markham, who happened to witness the kidnapping, sprang to his horse and galloped for help. Joseph was locked in an upper room in a tavern in Dixon and was refused permission to talk with anyone, but he would not be silenced. Shouting out of the window with a voice that could carry to an open-air congregation of 10,000 people, he proclaimed the tyranny of his captors till the whole village swarmed to hear him. The tavern-keeper, backed now by the indignation of the citizens, vowed that justice should be done and insisted that the prophet be granted a lawyer. When the sheriffs tried to disperse the crowd, angry warnings against the damned pukes and nigger drivers dissuaded them. There were shouts to let the Mormon be heard and good-humored calls for a sermon on marriage. "I addressed the assembly for an hour and a half on the subject of marriage," Joseph said. "My freedom commenced from that hour." It so happened that Cyrus Walker, head of the Whig Party and the greatest criminal lawyer in Illinois, was in Dixon at the time campaigning for election to Congress. Joseph at once requested his services. Walker drove a hard bargain, demanding not only a $10,000 fee, but also Joseph's vote in the next election. See Sermon of George A. Smith, October 1868, Journal of Discourses, Volume 13, page 109, and History of the Church, Volume 5, page 4. Once Joseph had agreed to these terms, the wheels of Illinois justice began grinding furiously on his behalf. The Missouri sheriffs were themselves sued for assault and false imprisonment, and held in $10,000 bail. It was agreed that the whole case should be unraveled before Judge Stephen A. D. Douglas, who was holding court in Quincy. When the party set forth, Joseph was still in the custody of the Missouri sheriffs, and they in turn in the custody of the Dixon sheriff. Joseph was obsessed with the fear that a conspiracy existed to kidnap him near Quincy and whisk him across the Mississippi. To forestall this, he sent word ahead for the Legion to meet him at Monmouth. Meanwhile, news of his arrest sent Nauvoo wild with apprehension. The city council declared virtual martial law, requiring every stranger entering the city to give his name, residence, and business to the local police, and enforcing a strict 9 o'clock curfew. See the Nauvoo Neighbor, Volume 1, Number 10, the 5th of July, 18th. 2 companies of the Legion were sent out to intercept the prophet, and Joseph's own steamboat, the Maid of Iowa, sailed to the mouth of the Illinois River, where its men could intercept every steamboat entering the Mississippi. Shortly after crossing the Fox River, Joseph saw 2 foaming horses charging up to the carriage. Convinced for a moment that his worst fears had come true, he was preparing to spring out for a fight when he recognized the men. He sank back with a half-sob of joy. "I am not going to Missouri this time. These are my boys." Before long, the carriage had an escort of 140 armed men. Many had ruined their horses with running and had forced whiskey down their throats to keep them going the last few miles. Men and horses alike were utterly exhausted, but they had saved their prophet, and every man was a hero. Walker was so anxious to give the rescue of Joseph Smith the appearance of a Whig victory that he let himself be persuaded to argue the case in Nauvoo instead of Quincy, where he suspected the political tactics of Stephen A. Douglas. The whole party, therefore, turned toward Nauvoo over the protests of the white-faced Missouri sheriffs, who feared they would never emerge from the Mormon city alive. As they came within view of the half-built temple, rising like a grotesque monument on the high ground to the northwest, they saw a long procession winding down the road. The citizens of Nauvoo, mustering every vehicle in the city, had turned out en masse to welcome the prophet home. A strange solemnity pervaded their greeting, as if Joseph had returned from the grave. Walker noted with astonishment that these men did not shout, but wept with thankfulness. Joseph took his place at the head of the procession with Emma, who was superbly dressed in a fine riding habit, her hat a glory of nodding white plumes. The Nauvoo brass band struck up Hail Columbia, and the procession wound its way slowly back to the city, where those who had been unable to find a place in a carriage lined. Crowds milled around the prophet's home after he arrived, unwilling to depart and calling for a sermon. At last he came out, leaped agilely to the top of the rail fence, and shouted, "I am out of the hands of the Missourians again, thank God. I bless you all in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. I shall address you at the Grove, near the temple, at 4 o'clock this afternoon." He gave a feast for 50 of his friends, and with an ironic gesture placed the 2 Missouri sheriffs in the places of honor. Later, he petitioned the Nauvoo Municipal Court for a writ of habeas corpus, which would render the Missouri writ void. In this petition, he argued that his name was not Joseph Smith, Jr., as the writ indicated, but Joseph Smith, Sr. He claimed also that he was not a fugitive from justice, that he had never committed treason against Missouri, and that he had already been tried for the same offense and acquitted in Warren County in June 1841. The true issue involved here, however, was not the validity of the Missouri writ, but the right of the Nauvoo Municipal Court to issue a writ of habeas corpus in a case ordinarily left to the state courts. Walker, with his eye fixed on a seat in the United States Senate, assured Joseph that under the special provisions of the Nauvoo Charter, the court did have such a right. Thus, wrote Governor Ford in reviewing this episode, the Mormons were deluded and deceived by men who ought to have known and did know better. Hogue, Walker's Democratic opponent, anxious not to be outdone, soon came to Nauvoo and concurred in Walker's interpretation. Joseph went to the grove triumphant. "I meet you with a heart full of gratitude to the Almighty God," he began. "I hardly know how to express my feelings. I feel as strong as a giant." Then he went to the heart of the problem. "Relative to our city charter, courts, right of habeas corpus, etc., I wish you to know and publish that we have all power. And if any man from this time forth says anything to the contrary, cast it into his teeth." All the power there was in Illinois she gave to Nauvoo, and any man that says to the contrary is a fool. This city has all the power that the state courts have. I wish the lawyer who says we have no powers in Nauvoo may be choked to death with his own words. Don't employ lawyers or pay them money for their knowledge, for I have learned that they don't know anything. I know more than they all. Pointing toward Walker, he said bluntly, "I have converted this candidate for Congress that the right of habeas corpus is included in our charter. If he continues converted, I will vote for him." Then he told the story of his arrest and rescue with a dramatic intensity that held 10,000 spectators breathless. "The time has come," he cried, "when forbearance is no longer a virtue, and if you or I are again taken unlawfully, you are at liberty to give loose to blood and thunder. Before I will bear this unhallowed persecution any longer, before I will be dragged away again among my enemies for trial, I will spill the last drop of blood in my veins, and will see all my enemies in hell." "Shall we bear it any longer?" he demanded. "No," the vast assembly roared. "I will lead you to battle, and if you are not afraid to die, and feel disposed to spill your blood in your own defense, you will not offend me. Be not the aggressor. Bear until they strike you on the one cheek. Then offer the other, and they will be sure to strike that. Then defend yourselves, and God will bear you off, and you shall stand forth clear before his tribunal. If mobs come upon you any more here, dung your gardens with them." History of the Church, Volume 5, pages 465-73. Governor Reynolds of Missouri, infuriated by what he deemed the insolence of Illinois politicians, issued another writ and demanded that Governor Ford call out the militia to capture the prophet. Walker raced to Springfield to persuade Ford to deny the demand. But Ford was naturally unwilling to throw so juicy a plum into Walker's outstretched hands just before election, and told him that the decision would first require careful investigation. Actually, Ford had no intention of calling out the militia merely to reverse the order of a court that had exceeded its jurisdiction. He disapproved of the Mormon abuse of their charters, but was convinced that the only way to stop it was through legislative repeal. He had, in fact, urged the legislature to abrogate the special Mormon privileges, but in this he had been opposed by the leaders of his own party, who were certain that repeal would cost them the Mormon vote. The prophet's brother William, elected to the state legislature from the Mormon county, had argued against repeal with savage skill, and had repeatedly threatened to throw the Mormons. Had the Democrats followed Ford's suggestion, they might have saved Illinois the sorriest chapter in its history. But unfortunately, Ford had no control over his party. The Democrats played politics to the bitter end. They sustained the unhealthy charters and later fought the Mormons for misusing them. A few days before the election, when Ford was absent in St. Louis, a prominent Democratic politician who had no faith in Ford's political judgment, sent word secretly to the Mormons that Ford would not call out the militia to arrest Joseph, provided the Mormons voted the Democratic ticket. See Thomas Ford, History of Illinois, pages 317-18. This put the prophet in a wretched dilemma. Had he been a wiser statesman, he would have let the normal democratic process run its course and allowed the Mormon vote to be divided. He could then have answered the ire of both parties in the name of the American Constitution. But two factors betrayed him into a disastrous political trick: his consuming fear of extradition in the political ambitions of his brother Hiram. Hiram had promised the Democrats the Mormon vote in return for a seat in the state legislature the following year. In the last week before election, he began openly campaigning for Hoge, the Democratic candidate. William Law was outraged at what he believed was a political sellout to further Hiram's personal ambitions, and fought him at every turn. Nauvoo was thunderstruck at the spectacle of Joseph's two closest aides at swords' points, and looked eagerly to the prophet to settle the issue. 5 days before election, the Nauvoo neighbor swung completely over to Hoge, and urged unanimity in the vote. It can answer no good purpose that half the citizens should disfranchise the other half, thus rendering Nauvoo powerless as far as politics are concerned. The 2nd of August, 1843, page 2. Then Hiram Smith amazed the Nauvoo electorate by announcing publicly that he had received a revelation from God that Hoge was the proper candidate to receive the Mormon vote. The day before the election, Joseph mounted the platform and broke his silence. "The Lord has not given me a revelation concerning politics. I have not asked him for one. As for Mr. Walker, he is the Whig candidate, a high-minded man. Before Mr. Walker came to Nauvoo, rumor came up that he might be a candidate. Said I, he is an old friend and I'll vote for him." This, Joseph then indicated, was his intention now as then. But before concluding, he added significantly, "Brother Hiram tells me this morning that he has had a testimony to the effect it would be better for the people to vote for Hoge, and I never knew Hiram to say he ever had a revelation, and it failed. Let God speak and all men hold their peace." The next day, Hoge received over 2,000 Mormon votes, which accounted for practically all of the Nauvoo electorate. The vote gave Hoge an election he would otherwise have lost, for his final majority amounted to about 700 votes. The Whigs, who had been completely certain of the Mormon vote, went wild. They never forgave Joseph for this betrayal. Whether Joseph realized the blunder he had made in this election, one cannot know. But he decided about this time that henceforth his political role would be commensurate with his status as a prophet anointed of the Lord. He was done, somewhat belatedly, with the local politics of Illinois. He would have no more to do with petty intrigues and truckling to corrupt politicians. James Arlington Bennett, a New York lawyer and writer who owned property in Illinois and had ambitions to become governor of the state through Mormon influence, wrote to Joseph Smith in October 1843 detailing the political strategy he hoped to use. This letter said pointedly, Muhammad had his right-hand man. Joseph, who had just renounced local politics, replied with a burst of rhetoric that put Bennett in his place. "Shall I stoop from the sublime authority of Almighty God to be handled as a monkey's catpaw and pedify myself into a clown to act the farce of political demagoguery? No, verily no. I combat the errors of ages. I meet the violence of mobs. I cope with illegal proceedings from executive authority. I cut the Gordian knot of powers, and I solve mathematical problems of universities. With truth, diamond truth, and God is my right-hand man." For this exchange of letters, see History of the Church, Volume 6, pages 71-8. Joseph was now fully intoxicated with power and drunk with visions of empire and apocalyptic glory. "One man empowered from Jehovah has more influence with the children of men," he said, "than 800 million led by the precepts of men." This thesis was his strength, and he set about using it to translate into reality what soberer men would have called delusions of grandeur. Any man with absolute dominion over a people, who brooks no advice that does not further his own daydreams, and who grinds out policies solely in the gristmill of his own ambition, sets up a kind of centrifugal force within himself that, by turning always away from the normal, may one day destroy him. "Joseph would allow no arrogance or undue liberties," said one friend, and criticisms, even by his associates, were rarely acceptable, and contradictions would rouse in him the lion at once, for by no one of his fellows would he be superseded. Unpublished letter of Benjamin Johnson to George S. Gibbs, 1903. Herein was his great strength, and his most fatal weakness, for no man whose chief virtues were love of compromise, justice, and prudence could set himself up as a prophet. but neither could any man who trampled on these virtues survive as a political force in America. Joseph now looked upon Nauvoo as a state within a state. "We stand in the same relation to the state as the state does to the Union," he said in an address to the City Council on the 25th of February, 1843. "Shall we be such fools as to be governed by its Illinois laws, which are unconstitutional?" History of the Church, Volume 5, page 289. With the bit in his teeth, he proceeded to run not only over the constitutions of Illinois and the United States, but also over the ancient traditions of English common law. He had the City Council pass an ordinance providing that if any officer came to Nauvoo with a writ for his arrest based on the old Missouri difficulties, he should be arrested, tried, and if found guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment in the city jail. He could be pardoned by the governor only with the consent of the Nauvoo mayor, that is, Joseph himself. Another ordinance made it a criminal offense for any officer to issue a warrant in Nauvoo without first having it signed and approved by the mayor. An earlier one, designed to prevent Joseph's creditors from exacting payment of debts in the form of property, had made gold and silver the only legal. The first ordinance was passed the 8th of December, 1843. The second, the 21st of December, 1843. The ordinance on gold and silver had been passed the 4th of March, 1843. All were repealed the 12th of February, 1844. See Nauvoo Neighbor, the 13th of December, 27, 1843, and History of the Church, Volume 5, page 297, Volume 6, pages 105, 212. When these ordinances were published in the Nauvoo Neighbor, they convinced even tolerant non-Mormon observers that the Mormon prophet held the law in complete contempt. And, as if this were not enough, Joseph prepared a petition for Congress in December 1843 in which he asked that Nauvoo be made a completely independent federal territory, with the Nauvoo Legion incorporated into the United States Army and the mayor of Nauvoo given power to call out the United States troops whenever necessary. This was one of Joseph's worst political blunders. The petition was certain to be rejected in Washington, and it may well have cost the Mormons what few remaining friends they had in Illinois, but Joseph by now had become a law unto himself. He had small faith that Congress would heed the petition, but he felt the Lord's thunderbolts heavy in his hand. "I prophesied by virtue of the holy priesthood vested in me, and in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that if Congress will not hear our petition and grant us protection, they shall be broken up as a government, and God shall damn them, and there shall be nothing left of them, not even a grease spot." Millennial Star, Volume 22, 1860, page 455. The words I have italicized were omitted when this passage was reprinted in the History of the Church, Volume 6, page 116. Actually, the hope of becoming governor of the federal territory of Nauvoo was a mere detail of his ambition. Joseph's utter incapacity for contentment with a moderate success, a want that had betrayed him again and again and was in the end to ruin him, led him now into his most grandiose political maneuvers. For many years Joseph had talked about building the kingdom of God upon earth, and with his increasing success the idea seems to have been subtly transformed from a mere symbol to a thing of substance. As he came more and more to look upon Nauvoo as an autonomous state, the kingdom of God assumed an unmistakably temporal nature. Finally, in the spring of 1844, Joseph began to organize a government to rule over what he hoped would eventually be a sovereign Mormon state. On the 11th of March, he began selecting with the utmost secrecy a council of 50 princes to form what one of them described as the highest court on earth. Few secrets in Mormon history have been better kept than the activities of this council, but it is clear that one of their first acts was to ordain and crown Joseph as king of the kingdom of God. The only detailed account of the activities of the Council of 50 was written by Bishop George Miller in his invaluable series of letters to the Northern Islander in 1855. These were reprinted in pamphlet form in Wisconsin by Wingfield Watson about 1915, and also in H.W. Mills' De Tal Palo Tal Estia, Historical Society of Southern California Publications, 1917, pages 86 to 172. See particularly pages 131 to 2. Thomas Ford had learned something of this kingdom before the publication of his History of Illinois in 1854. See pages 325-2. For other references, see William Decatur Cartner, Expedition of the Emmett Company, MS, a copy of which is in the Utah State Historical Society Library, the address of Lyman Wight on the 17th of December, 1851, published in the Gospel Banner, Volume 5, page 23, and the statement of William. I was also witness to the introduction, secretly, of a kingly form of government, in which Joseph suffered himself to be ordained king, to reign over the house of Israel forever. Zion's Harbinger and Baiamy's Organ, Volume 3, July 1853, page 5. There are many veiled allusions to the Council of 50 in Joseph's history, beginning with the entry of the 11th of March, 1844, and more definite references in Brigham Young's diary, as published in the Millennial Star, volumes 26-27. The Council of 50 was composed of men who had been reared in a tradition of militant democracy. They never dreamed of comparing their prophet with Aaron Burr, although it was the same fabulous opportunities that drove both men to destruction. What utterly disarmed Joseph's followers was that he had brought God into his realm, and these men lived close to a Bible in which God's servants had been kings. When Joseph, in a public speech on May 10, 1844, pronounced defiantly, I calculate to be one of the instruments of setting up the kingdom of Daniel by the word of the Lord, and I intend to lay a foundation that will revolutionize the whole world, only a handful knew that the kingdom had already been established. It will not be by sword or gun that this kingdom will roll on, he assured them. The power of truth is such that all nations will be under the necessity of obeying the gospel. But this was only partly true. The legion now numbered almost 4,000 men, and an arsenal and powder manufactory were being planned. History of the Church, Volume 5, page 430, Volume 6, page 233. There was substance here for an alarmist report in the New York Sunday that a great military despotism was growing up in the West. Joseph had never been so blind to the consequences of polygamy that he did not sense that someday his people would be forced to leave the United States, and the editorials in the Warsaw Message and Warsaw Signal early in 1844 made him realize reluctantly that emigration was probably the only alternative to civil war. Thomas Gregg, who had described Joseph on the 10th of January as that hoary monster who rules at Nauvoo, whose black heart would exult in carnage and bloodshed, rather than yield one iota of what power he has obtained by his hellish knavery, wrote in the Warsaw Message on the 17th of January. We see no use in attempting to disguise the fact that many in our midst contemplate a total extermination of that people, that the thousands of defenseless women and children, aged and infirm, who are congregated at Nauvoo, must be driven out, aye, driven, scattered, like the leaves before the autumn blast. But what good citizen, let us ask, what lover of his country and his race, but contemplates such an event with horror? With the passing weeks, Gregg's editorials became more and more apoplectic. We claim not to be a prophet nor the son of a prophet, he wrote on the 7th of February. Yet we tell you that your career of infamy cannot continue but a little longer. Your days are numbered. Joseph's notions of the geography of the vast territory lying west of Iowa were perhaps none too exact, but no man could have lived in independence without absorbing much of the lore of the Santa Fe Trail and the mountain men. In recent years, Marcus Whitman had made Oregon a synonym for the Promised Land, and 1842 had seen the first big emigrant train under Elijah White breaking a road to. In an open letter to the New York Herald, James Arlington Bennett had urged the prophet to pull up stakes and take possession of the Oregon Territory in his own right and establish an independent empire. In 100 years, he said, no nation on earth could conquer such a people. This letter Joseph had reprinted in the Wasp, along with articles extolling Oregon. Early in July 1843, he had sent Jonathan Dunham to explore a route to the Missouri River, and by August was frankly discussing a westward migration. There is some evidence that early in the spring of 1844, he ordered a few families under James Emmett and John L. Butler to move up the Missouri River, and put in crops in preparation for the wholesale migration of the church, but they were ordered to keep their intentions secret. See History of the Church, Volume 5, pages 86, 542-9, and William Decatur Cartner, Expedition of the Emmett Company, Miss, page 1. Actually, the Emmett expedition did not leave until after Joseph's death. Even at this late date, Joseph was not sure where he would take his people. On the 20th of February, he instructed the 12 apostles to send out a delegation of 25 men to investigate the locations of California and Oregon and hunt out a good location where we can remove to after the temple is completed and where we can build a city in a day and have a government of our own get up into the mountains, where the devil cannot dig us out, and live in a healthful climate where we can live as old as we have a mind to. History of the Church, Volume 6, page 222. Henry Clay and Stephen A. Dioglas both recommended Oregon. Joseph printed in the Neighbor a part of John C. Fremont's valuable report of his exploration to South Pass. Editorials in the Neighbor denounced British imperial interests in Oregon and echoed the cry of manifest destiny. But Joseph was troubled by the fact that Oregon was peopled largely by immigrant Missourians, and for a time turned his eye to the Southwest. Annexation of Texas was now the hottest political issue in the nation. On the one hand were the Southerners eager to increase the power of the slave bloc in Congress, and the nationalists who dreamed of a continental United States. Against them was the steady pressure of the Whig Party, led by Henry Clay, and the anti-slavery Democrats backing Van Buren. These feared that annexation would precipitate a war with Mexico and wished in any case to block an accretion of Southern power. The bloody border warfare between Texas and Mexico in 1842 had roused a violent agitation for annexation. But with the cessation of hostilities, the fever had abated, and in 1843, after Texan soldiers made an abortive attempt to intercept a gold-laden caravan from Santa Fe, the American press swung round to a denunciation of Texas that deluded many into thinking that annexation would never take place. Such was the situation when Joseph and the Council of 50 began seriously to consider a migration to the Southwest. Lyman Wight and George Miller were especially infected with Texas propaganda and urged moving the Wisconsin Black River Lumber Company to Texas as the first step in the migration of the church. Joseph had seen an article in the Texas Telegraph describing ruins of Indian temples on the Rio Puerco, and traces of ruined cities and aqueducts in the Cordilleras and on the Colorado. This set his imagination rocketing. What could be more appropriate than to build an empire on the site of the remnants of the vast civilizations described in his Book of Mormon? The Council of 50 was carried away by the Texas fever and dispatched Lucian Woodworth as minister to Texas with orders to negotiate a treaty. He was told to secure all that country north of a west line from the falls of the Colorado River, the Texas Colorado, not the great river of the far west, to the Nueces, thence down the same to the Gulf of Mexico, and along the same to the Rio Grande, and up the same to the United States territory. What Joseph was asking for was an enormous tract, comprising about 3/5 of modern Texas, the eastern half of New Mexico, the Oklahoma Panhandle, a bit of Kansas, a third of Colorado, and a section of south-central Wyoming. Texas was to recognize the Mormon nation, which in return would guarantee to help defend the Texans against Mexico, standing as a go-between between the belligerent powers. If Woodworth brought back a favorable reply, Lyman Wight and George Miller were to proceed to Texas with the Black River Lumber Company and take possession. George Miller's letters to the Northern Islander, 1855, tell this whole story. Joseph was not blind to the fact that regardless of whether he took his people northwest or southwest, he was asking for trouble. And out of his intense anxiety, both to provide security for his people and to satisfy his now completely unleashed ambition, came the most grandiloquent scheme of his whole life. This was a petition to Congress late in March 1844, that he be appointed an officer of the United States Army with power to raise 100,000 volunteers to patrol and police the western borders of the United States all the way from Texas to Oregon, Specifically, he promised to extend the arm of deliverance to Texas, to protect the inhabitants of Oregon from foreign aggressions and domestic broils, to open the vast regions of the unpeopled West and South, to supersede the necessity of a standing army on our western and southern frontiers, to search out the antiquities of the land, to break down tyranny and oppression and exalt the standard of universal peace. History of the Church, Volume 6, pages 276-7. This request for permission from the United States government to lead a private army of 100,000 men seems to the 20th century mind the delusion of a madman, but it was accounted merely excessive ambition in the fabulous 40s. Stephen A.D. Outless told Orson Hyde privately that if he could command the force at the disposal of the Mormon prophet, he would resign his seat in Congress and be on the march to Oregon or California within a month. Letter from Hyde in Washington, dated the 26th of April, 1844. Ibidem, Volume 6, page 3. President Tyler, in his third annual message to Congress, had strongly recommended the establishment of military posts along the Oregon Trail to furnish security and protection to our hardy adventurers against hostile tribes of Indians, and to take to the Western Territories the same kind of law established in the United States. It was this message, which fell into Joseph's hands late in January 1844, that more than anything else had prompted the petition. And it was the extravagance of Joseph's demands rather than their essential nature that ensured the petition's defeat. On May 25th, the House of Representatives refused to allow it to be read through on the floor. For a time, it looked as if plans for a Texan empire might mature. Woodworth returned from a conference with the Texas cabinet in May 1844 with a report to the Council of 50, which George Miller said was altogether as we could wish it. The council at once appointed 3 men to meet with the Texas Congress to ratify the treaty, Ibidem, Volume 6, page 356. But Joseph was not destined to be caught in the crossfire of the Mexican War, and the Mormon Church was spared certain destruction as a buffer state in the most explosive section of the continent. Nor was the prophet to face a wilderness war with the ex-Missourians in Oregon. Even the choice between alternatives was denied him. For though he possessed a disturbed prescience about the ultimate fate of his people were they to remain in the United States, and though he was bursting with his grandiose plans for a future in the West, Joseph could never believe that expulsion was close at hand. Nor could he bring himself to leave voluntarily the beautiful city on the Mississippi that was the fruit of his own genius. At the same time that Joseph was laying plans for a Western exodus, he was becoming actively involved in national politics. For 4 years he had tenaciously badgered Congress for redress for the Missouri persecution. Now, utterly cynical, he knew that he could win neither retribution for past suffering nor security for a future Western colony until Congress could be made to see that the Mormons were a political force to be reckoned with. This he intended to prove in the 1844 presidential election. He therefore wrote to all the leading presidential candidates and asked them bluntly what they would do to win justice for his people. When their replies were non-committal or negative, he decided to enter the lists himself. Send every man in the city who is able to speak in public throughout the land to electioneer and make stump speeches, he ordered. Advocate the Mormon religion, purity of elections, and call upon the people to stand by the law and put down mobocracy. Tell the people we have had Whig and Democratic presidents long enough. We want a president of the United States. Joseph suffered from no illusions about his chances of winning the supreme political post in the nation. He entered the ring not only to win publicity for himself and his church, but most of all to shock the other candidates into some measure of respect. We have as good a right to make a political party to gain power to defend ourselves, he said, as for demagogues to make use of our religion to get power to destroy us. Ibidem, Volume 6, pages 188-43. This was his justification for what otherwise might have seemed to be preposterous megalomania. He was simply following the tactics of the abolitionist Liberty Party, which, though extremely small, was to take enough votes away from Henry Clay in New York State in the 1844 election to throw the state to Polk and thus secure him the presidency, which incidentally resulted in what the Liberty Party feared most, the annexation of Texas. Joseph did err, however, in his appraisal of his vote-getting capacity. Nauvoo now had a population of some 12,000 Mormons, and the surrounding countryside contained about a third as many more. The Times and Seasons of the 15th of November 1845 quoted the St. Louis Evening Gazette saying the census of Nauvoo just taken showed 11,057 within the city limits and a third as many more outside. There were some defections after Joseph's death. 300 saints followed Rigdon to Pittsburgh. But there was so much optimistic talk about stupendous conversions in the States and in England that most of the citizens of Nauvoo. Joseph flung these figures about in his campaign speeches, estimating in a letter to Henry Clay that his people numbered 200,000. Times and Seasons, Volume 5, the 1st of June, 1844, page 547. The New York Herald caught the spirit of the Mormon campaign at once. They claim possession of from 200,000 to 500,000 votes in Nauvoo and throughout the Union, the editor wrote on May 23, 1844, and with that they calculate that they can hold the balance of power and make whoever they please president. Well, if so, they may be worth looking after. It seems by this movement that Joe Smith does not expect to be elected president, but he still wants to have a finger in the pie and see whether something can't be made out of it. The reactions of the Mormons to Joseph's candidacy varied all the way, from George Miller's ingenuous certainty that if the election was successful, Joseph and the Council of 50 would at once establish dominion in the United States, to John D. Lee's despairing complaint, "It was hard enough to preach the gospel without purse or scrip, but it was as nothing compared to offering the prophet Joseph to the people as a candidate for the highest gift of the nation. I would 1,000 times rather have been shut up in jail than to have taken such a trip, but I dared not refuse." James Arlington Bennett was first nominated for vice president, but when it was discovered that he was of foreign birth and therefore ineligible, Sidney Rigdon was finally At the nominating convention, held on May 17, 1844, a platform was written around the rallying cry, Jeffersonian democracy, free trade, sailors' rights, and the protection of person and property. Every man that could be spared, including the 12 apostles, went out campaigning, while Joseph busied himself writing campaign speeches unique in the history of American politics. His main theme, the natural fruit of his own experience, was that American liberty was on the wane and that calamity was about to destroy the peace of the people. "The world is governed too much," he wrote, "and there is not a nation or a dynasty now occupying the earth which acknowledges Almighty God as their lawgiver, and as crowns won by blood must be maintained. I go emphatically, virtuously, and humanely for a theodemocracy, where God and the people hold the power to conduct the affairs of men in righteousness." Nauvoo Neighbor, the 17th of April, 1844. The injection of God into the government of the United States was the most sensational plank in Joseph's platform. That it would have meant a repudiation of democracy in favor of a one-party state, Hiram Smith made clear when he proclaimed, "We want a president of the United States, not a party president, but a president of the whole people. For a party president disfranchises the opposite party. Damn the system of splitting up the nation into opposite belligerent parties." History of the Church, Volume 6, page 323. Joseph further advocated, reduce Congress at least 2 senators from a state and 2 members to 1,000,000 of population will do more business than the army that now occupy the halls of the national legislature. Pay them $2 and their board per diem except Sundays. That is more than the farmer gets, and he lives honestly. With his unhappy experience in Liberty Jail still vivid in his memory, he advocated a drastic reform of the American. "Turn the jails into seminaries of learning," he said. "Make work upon roads and public works the punishment for crime, and reserve rigor and seclusion only for those guilty of murder. Abolish imprisonment for debt, and pardon every convict, saying to him in the name of the Lord, 'Go thy way and sin no more.'" Then, in a complete reversal of his earlier stand, he advocated freeing the slaves. "Let the slaveholders be paid for them," he urged, "out of the surplus revenue arising from the sale of public lands. Break off the shackles from the poor black man, and hire him to labor like other human beings, for an hour of virtuous liberty on earth is worth a whole eternity of bondage. see Views on the Powers and Policy of the United States Government, as published in Times and Seasons, Volume 5, May 15, 1844. Later reprints deleted certain portions. Here he was echoing the sentiments of the Liberty Party, which since 1839 had been trying to create a third party out of the slavery issue. Unlike any other presidential candidate, Joseph was at the same moment anti-slavery and pro-annexation, and his compromise was ingenious. Bring Texas into the Union, he urged, but curtail the power of the slave bloc at the same time by abolishing slavery in the states bordering the Mason-Dixon line. By now, Joseph's attitude toward the Negro had become so liberal, partly as a result of his correspondence with the abolitionist C.V. Dyer, that he argued with Orson Hyde that if the roles of Negro and white were reversed, the former would quickly assume the characteristics of the latter. See History of the Church, Volume 5, page 217. The demagogic Hyde was not impressed, and his conviction that the abolitionists were trying to make void the curse of God was never wholly erased from Mormon thinking, particularly since it could be reinforced by the unfortunate anti-Negro sentiments in Joseph's Book of Abraham. See Hyde's editorial in Times and Seasons, Volume 6, the 1st of April, 1845, page 857. The Utah Church accepted the ideological fruits of Joseph's earlier stand, which actually had been a political compromise, and rejected this more courageous about-face because it was merely an utterance in a political campaign. Today the Negro is still denied a place in the Mormon priesthood. Joseph's campaign documents were reprinted in many of the Eastern papers, and provoked a good deal of editorial jesting. "Who is this modern knight with his magic lamp?" asked the Boston correspondent on May 22. "It is the Green Mountain Boy of old Vermont, the ignorant farmer of western New York, the unlettered fool of sectarian tales, the scourge and terror of outlawed Missouri, the favorite military chieftain of Illinois, the admired of millions, the dread of politicians, the revered of savages, the stumbling block of nations and the wonder of the world, and to cap the climax, he is J.O. Smith, the Mormon prophet." "When I get hold of the Eastern papers and see how popular I am," Joseph said one day in high spirits, "I am afraid myself that I shall be elected." History of the Church, Volume 6, page 243. Despite the undertones of disaster that were rumbling in and about Nauvoo, he seemed to be riding securely astride the whirl. He was not only candidate for president, but also mayor of Nauvoo, judge of the municipal court, merchant of the leading store, hotel keeper, official temple architect, real estate agent, contractor, recorder of deeds, steamboat owner, trustee in trust for all the finances of his church, lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, spiritual advisor and Lord's communicant to the true church, king of the new kingdom of God, and husband of almost 50 wives. "I want the liberty of thinking and believing as I please," he said. "It feels so good not to be trammeled." And for all the tarring and feathering, the arrests, the leg irons, and the threats of death, America had permitted Joseph Smith the liberty of going fast and far. "Who can wonder," wrote Josiah Quincy, "that the chair of the national executive had its place among the visions of this self-reliant man? He had already traversed the roughest part of the way to that coveted position. Born in the lowest ranks of poverty, without book learning, and with the homeliest of all human names, he had made himself at the age of 39 a power upon earth. Almost never in these days did Joseph step outside himself and look with surprise and humility upon what he had become. But once, in this spring of 1844, at the funeral of a certain King Follett, he delivered one of the most profound sermons of his whole career. For the first time he proclaimed in a unified discourse the themes that he had been inculcating in fragments and frequently in secret to his most favored saints: the glory of knowledge, the multiplicity of gods, the eternal progression of the human soul. And when he was almost finished, and the exaltation of spirit that motivates a great sermon was exhausting itself, he paused and, in a wanton moment of self-searching, said, with a kind of wonder, "You don't know me. You never knew my heart. No man knows my history. I cannot tell it. I shall never undertake it. I don't blame anyone for not believing my history. If I had not experienced what I have, I could not have believed it myself.